Hello, everyone. We're back. Another show down the drain. Three Wonks, episode number 15. Hello, everyone. We're
God
back.
damn it. I did it
Another
again.
show
I can't help
down the
myself.
drain.
I cannot help myself but start the show, but I've got the fucking stream going in the background. Fuck! Anyway, okay. Another false start. We're not professionals here. Let me lower my gain slightly. Anyway, thanks for tuning in to another Three Wonks episode. Three Wonks is a primarily policy-focused podcast with three policy wonks featuring socialist, socialism done left, new liberal, Micah, Irfan, and myself, social democrat, Econo Boy. We would, of course, like to thank our Patreons who support a policy-dense show in a polarized and sensationalist media environment. If you'd like to become a Patreon to support our show, head on over to patreon.com/the3wonks, /3wonks, and become a member for as little as $3 a month. Get some cool benefits and support our show. Today we're going to talk about Project 2025. What is it? And what don't we like about it? Maybe we like some things about it. Who knows? We'll find out. We're also taking a positive spin for the audience topic this week. What does America do right economically? We often criticize, because they're deserving of criticism, the institutions of America. But what do our economic institutions in America do right this time around? We're going to talk about that. However, before we get into that, we have two kind of additional topics that we want to run through just real quick. It's not going to take that much time. Number one, okay, we got a fun little thing that we're planning, all right? For those of you that follow me on Twitter, Econo Boy, Micah and SDL have many more followers than I do, but I have a much more banging Twitter than either of them, okay? The free market of Twitter followers does not reflect merit, if you ask me. Not surprising in our capitalist system. But long ago, in a ploy for Twitter followers and in something that I thought would be very fun, we did a policy tournament where you had all these like 128 different policies of various themes, immigration, labor policy, welfare policy, whatever it is. And we just had this policy tournament, and then Twitter people would vote on which policies they preferred until we got all the way down to, the number one policy, or like the issue prioritization, essentially fully, hit all the way down to the bottom. And with this, we're going to do the same thing. And so it's going to come in various stages. So what I've had each of the guys do, including myself, we've each submitted 30 to 40 policies independently. So we've come up with these policies independently. And then, because socialist, social democratic, and liberal policies are sometimes the same, like for instance, I don't know, like raising the income tax or something, like we might have that on all three of our platforms. We're going to do a draft of these policies in the next 2 weeks. So next show in 2 weeks, all the policies we have overlapping, we're going to draft them to be on our side. And this is how you can get involved as a Patreon member. Go to patreon.com/3wonks to suggest policies. There's a pinned post where you can suggest policies that we will include in the draft as well. And we will draft those amongst the three of us. And then we will whittle those policies down into 21 policies each. And then we'll have, maybe a random policy, or maybe a policy all three of us agree on, or something like that, to make it 64. And then we'll set up the Twitter polls and the policy brackets and all that stuff for people on the Three Wonks Twitter to vote on. It'll be a fun little exercise, and we'll hopefully engage in some wonky policy discussion like happened on my Twitter when I had these two separate policy brackets. They were just really, really fun. So hopefully you guys enjoy that. I'm not liking the stream. You will not entice me with your authoritarian statement, White Knight. How dare you, sir? You need to like the stream or you're banned, okay? You have 5 seconds to like the stream. I'm watching. And so that'll be a fun thing. So join the Patreon if you want to suggest policies. $3 a month, pretty easy. And other than that, tune in the next show where we'll do our policy draft and we'll discuss some of our policies. It'll also be interesting to see which of our policies are like our number one draft picks. So we'll see how that works out. It'll kind of end up being, I think, 3 separate drafts, because there might be policies that I share with SDL that I don't share with Micah, and vice versa. SDL and Micah might have policies they share, and then we might have policies all three of us share, including the Patreon policies, which we'll draft as the three of us. So that'll be really interesting, if you ask me. However, now that that's done, one last topic that's not reflected in the title. Gentlemen, obviously, we've had a shakeup in the Democratic primary. Kamala Harris
Mamala, our queen, she's taken us all the way to November into the White House a second time in a row, if you ask me. But the big question on everyone's mind is, who is her vice presidential pick going to be? Because we don't just have a new presidential candidate, we're going to have a new vice presidential candidate, and that's what everyone is talking about. And so what I'm curious about from the two of you is, who do you want? Who's the best vice presidential pick, if you ask yourselves? Micah, let's start with you.
So we have a list that I did put in our chat so we could share it with them. My favorite of all time, my ideal person is Jared Polis. For some reason, I don't think he's going to be selected. Now, out of the list that we have, it's about like 6 names on this list that are actually relevant. The governor of North Carolina, Roy Cooper, the governor of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro, the senator from the state of Arizona, Mark Kelly. We have Andy Beshear, the governor of Kentucky. Let's see, what are the other relevant ones? Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, and then Gretchen Whitmer doesn't want to do it. So I think it's 5, right? Am I missing somebody?
No, I think
it's 5 relevant people.
That's about it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's all the relevant. I mean, there's a bunch of irrelevant, like Gavin Newsom. There's no way he's going to get it. Out of those, I know Josh Shapiro gets a lot of hate. I think he's probably the best pick because we win Pennsylvania. He's a great speaker. On a lot of issues, I think he takes the right stance. For instance, he's getting attacked because he supported cutting taxes for businesses, amongst other tax cuts for people in the state. Now, I think he was 100% correct on that because state level corporate taxes are especially inefficient, as y'all know, viewers. On this Wonk podcast, despite the fact that we're left of center, none of us are huge fans of corporate taxes because corporate taxes are distortionary and impose taxation on investment, which has negative effects, not just on businesses, but on the rest of society. So it's an inefficient tax form, and it's especially inefficient at the state level where it's easier to avoid. And so he supports, I'd say, smart workforce development policies. He's good on tax reform. He's been attacked as well for supporting not school vouchers, but other forms of school choice. I'm a big fan of magnet schools, so I think that it would be nice to have a vice presidential candidate which is kind of open to those ideas, which used to be more dominant in the Democratic Party. So I think he'd be my favorite choice, and my second favorite would probably be Andy Beshear.
Okay. Yeah, I think where I come in on this amongst the list that we see here, so I would generally agree. Gina Raimondo, don't even know why she's on the list. She's definitely not going to be the pick. Raphael Warnock, in theory, potentially a great pick, but unfortunately, there's a lot of, and I'll get into this later, there's a lot of these weird, I think, misgivings about the idea of having like a racially gender balanced ticket where, like, I think Harris and Warnock would be a perfectly serviceable Democratic ticket, but there's so many people on the inside of Democratic politics who would say, well, we can't have 2 black people on the same ticket. We just can't do it. For some reason, there's just a reason we can't do it. And the reason is that America just can't handle 2 black people being on the same ticket for one reason or another. For the same reason I eliminate Governor Wes Moore, he's also not a particularly relevant pick. Gavin Newsom's not going to happen because they're both from California. And it's not clear that they actually have that close or good of a relationship, even though, in theory, Kamala and Gavin Newsom go way back. I mean, she was the district attorney of San Francisco when he was the mayor of San Francisco. So, I mean, presumably they actually have a pretty long working relationship, but I just haven't heard that they have a great relationship. Pritzker's not going to get picked. Most likely, he just doesn't have a big enough national profile.
Tim Walz is missing from this list.
Tim Walz is missing from this list. Well, maybe we'll talk about him later. But let me bring up, here's the person that I think would be best. Gretchen Whitmer. I know Micah's already mentioned, well, she said she's not interested. Okay, but here's the thing. I don't care about that. We need to force her in to the vice presidential pick, kicking and screaming if we have to. I think she would be an excellent pick for vice president. Here's why. Number 1, all the misgivings about 2 women on the ticket are stupid and they're dumb. And I don't believe them, okay? I don't think that America would just, like, vote for Trump because 2 women are the alternate choice. Number 2, people don't really care that much about vice president. We're talking about a small margin of voters, right? And so when you're picking VP, it's like, who's going to increase your chances the most? All of these picks increase your chance a little bit maybe, and a lot maybe. So your downside risk is always bigger for VP. The downside risk of 2 women, I don't think, is very, very big. Now, who is Gretchen Whitmer? She's the governor of a swing state, Michigan, arguably the most important swing state symbolically, the heart of the Rust Belt. I think she would be an excellent strategic pick for that reason. Also, she's really, really popular in her state. Also, the base of the Democratic Party, ultimately, when you think about it, the biggest Democratic base is women. 100% it's women. Like 65%, 60% of women vote for Democrats, right? I mean, it's a huge demographic of the country that's overwhelmingly democratic. And I do actually think there's a margin of women that we could add on top of that who would look at 2 women being on the ticket and say, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and vote for these 2 women instead of this crazy radical misogynist Donald Trump. And same thing with JD Vance. It's an excellent message as well in an election year where Roe v. Wade is such a mainstay part of our messaging and our platform this year around. Having 2 women on the ticket is incredibly symbolic in a positive way. Unfortunately, though, there's a bunch of dinguses in Washington who say that 2 women can't be on the ticket. And so because of this ridiculous sexism, we just can't have it happen. I think it's ridiculous. SDL, who's your favorite pick amongst these? Oh no, his mic. It's SDL's mic this time.
Oh my god.
God damn.
Now it's the deep states after
How does it
him.
feel, SDL?
It's terrible. It's the worst. I'm a Walls fan. So Minnesota isn't a super swing state, but it's
Who
very
is
close
Walls?
to Michigan.
SDL.
He's the governor of Minnesota. And the arguments for it, I think, are fairly straightforward. So when the Democrats came back into power in Minnesota, they had a very narrow majority, and they passed a shit ton of really good policies that we would pretty much all agree with here. So just list off a few. They passed a bill calling for 100% clean energy by, I think, like 2030 or 2035. They passed free school lunches for all, which is part of the story that Walls tells about himself, that he served school lunches and now he gives free school lunches to all. He's a former military man. He got universal background checks on guns. They got 3 months of paid and sick leave. They got the Green Development Bank. So they got a climate investment bank, which is something that you've talked a lot about, Econoboy, which is, again, it's one of those remarkable things to see at a state level from like Democrats. And of course, they legalized weed. And so, you know, my point is that if you want someone who has experience as governor, who has experience running a fairly narrow majority legislature, but still getting some fairly transformative bills through, well, Walls fits it. He's got the military background. I don't know. I think it all just sort of it all fits. I am like, in addition, like I'm proposing him, and just because I think he's the most progressive candidate, but I think also the policies that he proposes are incredibly popular. Like, how easy is it to run against JD Vance when he thinks that you should be taxing childless people and you want to give free school lunches to everyone? Like, the contrast really couldn't be clearer. So I think the story there is actually quite useful.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. It's interesting because he kind of came out of nowhere. Kind of all of a sudden, he's one of the main people are speculating about with regards to Governor Walls. Maybe that's purposeful. Like, a lot of these things are sort of manufactured. Like, maybe Kamala had Tim Walls in her head and she's like, hey, I need you to do a few national interviews. We're going to kind of try you out and just kind of see how that goes. I think that's how a lot of these things end up getting organized. I think there's a lot of sort of behind like unknown tryouts that these VP candidates end up doing. Like, for, you know, when Trump was figuring out his VP, you saw Doug Burgum all of a sudden on a lot of national news networks, right? And it's like, I don't know if Doug Burgum is typically getting invited onto a lot of national news networks, right? I think a lot of it's sort of these implicit tryouts. Now, I think we all kind of said who our preferred. So are all of our picks our like strategic picks, or are they our ideal picks? So like for me, mine is kind of both in one sense. Like, I think Gretchen is probably my favorite pick for what I mentioned, but also I think strategically she's the strongest. But for you guys, is Shapiro and Walls, do you guys think that those are the best strategic picks and your ideal picks as well?
Yeah, so I think we should list both. By the way, I just sent you a different picture, which is more accurate because it includes Tim Walz and excludes a bunch of people.
And it has JD Pritzker, of course, the big boy that we haven't talked about.
I talked about
yeah, he's really not being considered.
Yeah,
Neither is Gretchen. It's really like the sixth. Pete, we didn't mention that Pete's being mentioned, actually considered as well. I'd say the best strategic pick is Josh Shapiro because that gets you Pennsylvania. The real question about his strategic value is how bad the backlash will be against him. Because I know that there's some more left-wing people which have issues with him because of some of his stances. There's a question about the electoral impact there, but I think that the impact on Pennsylvania alone, that's a state that we have to win. So he probably would be the best electoral pick. In terms of ideology, I'd say Pete Buttigieg. I agree with most ideologically because I think people severely underestimate how based Pete is. Like Pete is super urbanist
from the trenches. Yeah, go on, Micah.
Pete is super urbanist. He's such a nerd. He's the kind of guy who probably knows what land value tax is and likes it. He's the kind of guy who could watch probably one of our 3 Wonks episodes and actually understand what we're talking about. That doesn't always translate to his rhetoric because I think he's very comms-minded with the policies that he communicates. But at the end of the day, you know he's a nerd. And the reason why you know he's a nerd is because he supported a vehicle mileage tax as transportation secretary. He received huge backlash. But that's the kind of policy you only support if you're wonk-pilled. The wonk policy.
Yeah, that's fair. I think again with Pete though, there's just, I mean, unfortunately, I've just heard so many people say, "Oh, but he's gay, and so we can't make him vice president." And I just don't like this logic. I don't think it's right. You know, not that I don't like. It's not just that I think it's wrong to say we shouldn't give a guy a job because he's gay or because she's a woman, which is the case with Pete Buttigieg and Gretchen Whitmer on this list. But it's also, I just don't think it's strategically correct, right? Like when people say, oh, like, is America going to elect a black woman and a gay dude on the same election? It's like, well, I don't know. I think probably yes. Like if you looked at, for instance, the hypothetical polling with Pete, it seemed like he was polling as a presidential candidate. He was polling about the same as Kamala Harris. And I think he had similar upside. Like the internal Democratic polling that got leaked actually had Pete Buttigieg being the best candidate when it came to actually polling against Donald Trump when you name recognition adjust the polls. And so I don't, what do you guys make of all this? Like, I think the speculation about 2 women on the ticket or a gay man on the ticket, it's like, what are you guys talking about? I don't think this is actually as detrimental as people are saying.
Well, just before we get to that, I mean, on the question of is like Tim Walz the strategic pick? I'm not entirely sure because he hasn't shown up in a lot of the national polling. As you say, Pete Buttigieg polls pretty well. At the same time, I'm not sure how much we can trust polls nowadays. Like, unfortunately, I think a lot of when you look at the crosstabs of polls, they seem to be really screwed up. So I don't know that we can put a lot of stock in them anymore. So I guess what I would point to is like there is a value actually in looking to people who were able to win an election. So like governors like both Shapiro and Walz would fit that. I guess just to answer the question of is Walz the strategic pick, like probably Whitmer is like the maximum strategic pick, but she's not being considered. And like I support Walz partially for ideological reasons, partially also I just think that I'm really convinced Democrats need a story to tell the American people, and that sometimes when you get sort of centrist moderate types, they don't talk about policy. Kamala hasn't highlighted like a single policy that she wants to enact when she comes into office. Like she as like her big signature
That's
thing.
not true.
No, just like what is the big signature policy people associate with Kamala Harris?
Well, I mean, I mean, she's only been on the campaign trail for a couple of days, but she has said specific policies like paid family leave, like codifying Roe v. Wade. I mean, I don't know how specific we expect speeches to be, but she has mentioned actual policy positions. Now, here's something I'll agree with you on.
She has mentioned them.
The campaign has no policies on their website, which is frankly a little bit ridiculous at this point.
No, it's really silly. But I guess what I was trying to get at is that I think there's a benefit to highlighting a policy as like a headline thing. Part of what made Sanders successful, I think, is that he highlighted certain policies that were very popular, like $15 minimum wage. And because he wasn't that well known at the time, he rode that into popularity. I think there's a benefit of Democrats trying to do the same thing. So like Walz passed one of the first true public health insurance options in this country. Surely that's something that Dems can run on. Like, hey, let's just pass this nationwide. Let's do a public health insurance option. Yeah. Like we've rolled out in 3 states, like Minnesota's about to roll out. Let's just do it everywhere. Biden said he wanted it. Let's actually do it.
One thing that I absolutely do love about Walz, and I tweeted about this, is he's one of the few Democrats on the planet, one of the few people who are Democrats that get TV time, who are willing to fiercely defend the idea of the welfare state, right? So many Democrats are like, well, yeah, I mean, maybe work requirements do make sense. And like, yeah, sure, we should means test welfare. And like, yeah, welfare historically isn't that great. Meanwhile, Chad Governor Walz comes in and he's like, listen, welfare's a hand up, not a handout. It's good. Also, universalism makes sense. That's why I gave all the kids free meals in my state, okay? He's based as hell when it comes to the welfare state, and I think that those ideas are probably something that's good. I was talking to my friend the other day, and he said he was talking to some leftists who said that Democrats have shifted to the right, and he mentioned the welfare state, and I was like, when you think about it, the welfare state, Democrats have shifted to the right on the welfare state significantly over time until just recently, because if we think about the timeline, we go from Jimmy Carter, who, by all accounts, Jimmy Carter, Southern Democrat proper, right? Not exactly the most progressive Democrat on many assorted issues. I believe he supported things like work requirements for welfare. Then we go into the neoliberal turn under Reagan and George H.W. Bush, and then Bill Clinton as well, who Bill Clinton, if there's any president in like the postmodern era that dismantled the welfare state more, it was Bill Clinton by block granting out so many welfare programs to the states, which have so many problems to this day. And then we go into George W. Bush, and then we go into Obama, who didn't exactly significantly reform the welfare state. We had Medicaid expansion, but that was about it. And then we go into Donald Trump, and then we finally go into Biden, who proposes huge welfare state expansion and maybe slightly more universalism and cash assistance with things like the child tax credit. But ultimately, those were temporary, right? Those were temporary measures. And so we really have had like a stagnant or cut welfare state over the last 40 years if we're considering like non-elderly welfare, right? And it's just a more and more inefficiently organized system over time. So I really do think we're due for a Democrat who's in office who's like, yeah, like it's like the welfare state isn't the most evil thing in the world, and it's actually a good thing, and it takes people out of poverty, and we should reorganize it this way and that way. And I don't know, Governor Walz is the only one that I've seen that's really taken up that mantle, I guess.
I will say there's a banger quote from him. Just a brief thing, a banger quote on that from yesterday. Quote, "I'm all for pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, but we didn't have any boots. Social Security was the boots."
Exactly.
Welfare's strongest defender. Go ahead, Micah.
Yeah. I think he's really great on that issue, and I think it is really important for left of center parties to support the welfare state or some sort of social safety net. It's broad based. Broad-based taxation and broad-based benefits is like the thing that allows left of center parties to win in many countries because it is the most popular element. And I mean, it's just good policy. Right now, we are obsessed with complicated means-tested arrangements funded exclusively by mostly inefficient taxes on higher income folks. And you're just never going to defeat social ills like poverty, like job block, using those kind of programs. But I think we all probably agree. I mean, it seems like all of these picks, like none of these picks are particularly bad, right? I mean, I think I'd be okay with any of them.
I think I would be, that's right. I would be okay with any of them. I would say my dark horse bad pick might be Mark Kelly. Now, as hard as that is to say, because I think Mark Kelly is not a bad pick necessarily, I will say, however, that his record on labor does seem a little suspect. I think any Democrat that's not co-sponsoring the PRO Act, like right out the gate, is definitely kind of sus to me. Now, arguably, he did run on basically being an independent leader and how, he was going to try and be Maverick style like John McCain, whose seat he overtook. I get all that. Maybe he's much more pro-labor than he leads on. He's one of the more anti-gun senators from a swing state, obviously because his wife almost got
Gabby
assassinated.
Giffords is his wife, right?
Right, yeah. And so he's been pretty bold on that position. And I think now that he's in VP consideration, I think he's been trying to distance himself from his less pro-labor positions. And so I don't know. That does kind of worry me about Mark Kelly, but I'm sure that if he becomes VP, he'll change his tune significantly. Hopefully that's the case.
Well, I think it's also important to note that his claim was that it was just a specific provision or like assortment of provisions that he had an issue with, not the entire thing, right? I mean, a lot of the PRO Act is just saying it's really illegal to union bust. Like, let's just make that very illegal.
Hell yeah.
And I don't really feel like that's something that anybody in the Democratic side has an issue with. So I imagine it was a different provision. But other than that, I mean, that's the one criticism people have levied at this guy, it seems like.
Well, he's
I
also
will
not.
say-
I would say that he's the least polished as well of these guys. Like he's not of all these people, he's probably the worst public speaker. And that's another thing that I think is probably something worth considering. But I mean, he's a fine pick though overall. It's like you said, all these people are on the spectrum of okay to great. You know, none of them are particularly bad, if you ask me.
I do know that the American Federation of Teachers specifically asked the Harris campaign not to pick either Shapiro or Kelly, just because of like school voucher related issues. So that would be the only major rejection I would try to put, like not Shapiro, not Kelly. But I mean, all of them are fine compared to Trump. Like, I don't know, Democrats are the popular front. I'll boost them no matter what. But
well, yeah, the thing about Shapiro is what I've heard is that he was initially pro vouchers, but then he ended up vetoing the bill. I mean, to the extent that's true, I mean, that's a pretty cringe take because vouchers is bad policy. I think you could be like a Democrat and support public school choice. That's kind of my position. Vouchers is definitely a bridge too far, a bridge way too far. I'm surprised about that Mark Kelly point, though. I never heard that he was bad on the issue.
So I honestly have not read into why the AFT doesn't like Kelly, because I didn't think he was a serious candidate, so I didn't look into it. But I know they were pissed about Shapiro.
I think he's probably one of the top candidates.
What I would say is, I think
from the reporting,
I think Bashir is the option that makes literally no one upset and everyone marginally happy. I think more moderate voters like him because he hasn't really done anything like crazy left wing, and like he has very moderate aesthetic. But progressives like him because he's literally never done anything that's conservative ever. Like every time he's had the opportunity to take a progressive stance, he has. It's just Kentucky, so there's no poison pills for anybody. I think Roy Cooper is good, but his issue is that he's old, and I think there's an aesthetic problem with that.
67
like you
years
don't
old.
want sending. This is a generational change election, and you don't want to send the kind of older man against JD Vance because that just hurts our entire framing of this race.
Yeah, JD Vance is people kind of they don't realize how young he is. JD Vance is only 38 years old. Last I checked, like he's actually an incredibly young.
Think about that, chat.
Vice presidential.
You're 30. Okay, you think that your life's over, but in 8 years, all you need to do is fuck a couch, search up some dolphin porn, and you could be the vice president of the United States.
That's true. Write a book about Mima, and you're good. You're good from there. But I think Bashir is. He's an extremely inoffensive pick. I think he would be a pretty strong pick as well. He's always been my dark horse for VP, where like in the initial sort of speculation of who would replace Biden, a lot of like there was a small chunk of people, let's say, who were saying Bashir, but I was like, I don't think he'll be the presidential candidate, but he's an excellent choice for vice president. And so, yeah, it's hard to say. I think Mark Kelly's probably, at this point, I would say Mark Kelly's the most likely pick just because the only reporting that I've seen that signals a decision on vice president has been, other than just like, these are the people we're considering, has been that apparently Kamala has like a good personal relationship with Mark Kelly. And I haven't heard that about any other candidate. And so, not that she hates these other candidates, but that she like personally is buddies or has a good working relationship with Mark Kelly, which, given that that's the only information I have to go off of, I'm just going to say, like, yeah, Mark Kelly's probably the most likely pick in my estimation, but obviously
there's a lot of
change.
people in Congress. There's a lot of people in Congress which are lobbying for Mark Kelly. He's like the favorite, which makes sense because, I mean, out of all of these, he's the only one that's actually in Congress. And I think Josh Shapiro, what's made it more difficult for him is I think he was the natural choice in the beginning, but there has been like full-on character assassination on the internet of people like just trying to drag his name through the mud. It's still totally possible he's picked, but people have really gone hard at him. And there also has been a concerted effort for people to support Tim Walz.
I think
what I've been so surprised by is all the hate Pete Buttigieg has received. Like, I've seen it from all sides. People on the left are like, Pete Buttigieg is like super right wing and believe in anything like that. And then people on the right are like, Pete Buttigieg is super left wing. And like, we don't like him at all. And I'm just like, what did he do? I think I'll have this picture of Pete Buttigieg from like the 2020 primary.
Oh no, his mic.
like everything they despised about him as a person. And I don't know. I have the feeling if she did in fact pick Pete Buttigieg and he could really get airtime, I think I really don't think he'd be a bad pick. I think he actually does a fantastic job appealing to the kind of moderate swing voters, the independents, and the apolitical folks that we need to win this election.
He's an extremely excellent surrogate, and that's one of the reasons why I think he would be a great VP pick. And the gay thing is just totally irrelevant in my decision making as well. Like, people who talk about that stuff is ridiculous as like an actual reason for not picking him. But I don't know. I think that, yeah, in his 2020 primary, I feel like his aesthetic, like literally just like his aesthetic rubbed progressives the wrong way. And what I mean by that is like he is it just wasn't his moment, it seemed, right? And I don't know if it ever will be. A lot of people say like, oh, he'll be the nominee one day. It's like, I really don't know if that is the case. It's possible. I mean, 2028 is a long time from now. Anything can change. But, well, Kamala's probably running for re-election 28, but 2032, he'll still be a young man on the political landscape. He'll be in his like, what is it, late 40s or early 50s or something. So I just think that he comes off as like an extremely polished politician. Very, very like establishment type politician. He even got the classic sweep over hairdo, right? He's almost like you gave a person the Captain America politician serum, right? Like, and I think that a lot of people, that just turns them off to a guy like Pete Buttigieg, whether that's fair or not. And to be fair, I mean, Pete Buttigieg does do certain things that aren't authentic, right? Like, like when he takes like people chastised him, pun not intended because his husband's name is Shaston, but people chastised him for like taking strategic pictures of him reading like books because he wants to come off as like intellectual during the campaign, or like people criticized him for doing those a lot. I mean, every politician does this, but people criticized him because he was running against Bernie, who does not do this, like taking private donor-based meetings with business leaders and things like this, and that rubbed people the wrong way because you had so many candidates in the 2020 primary say, I'm not doing that, I'm not taking corporate or PAC donations or doing this kind of bundling, and so that rubbed people the wrong way. And as well, I guess progressives were just perturbed by the fact that he just has a very, he did have a relatively moderate message. He was kind of one of the bigger like deficit hawks in the primary as well, talking about how like we absolutely need to balance the budget and like this is a big deal that Democrats should take seriously. And it's not that it's not, it's just that
I don't really remember that, but if he did that, that was based.
Yeah, it's not that it's not that it's not an issue to take seriously, but it's just that I think that as a message for a campaign, especially, that's not going to resonate as much as the positive. Even if you think on the back end we should balance the budget, your positive message should talk about welfare and state capacity expansion, in my view, not like, oh yeah, we just like as a value we need to balance the budget, right? Like that's probably not as important. So I think, and that's not saying that these things are correct. It's just I think that's why he rubs so many progressives the wrong way. So
I really do think you're right in saying that a lot of it was aesthetic. I think especially 4 years ago, he looked super polished. He looked very pale. He kind of looked like a suburban white church boy, which explained why he did really well with like Iowan suburban white voters that are like middle class.
Oh no. Big Mike.
It doesn't really appeal to, I think, working class voters and also like young progressive, like more edgy people who like don't want somebody who's so cut and dry. I think over the past 4 years, he's made a concerted effort to change his aesthetic without actually like changing who he is. As you notice, I think he's actually gotten a tan, which maybe just all politicians are doing this these days. Biden started wearing bronzer, but he's darker. I think he's gained weight. I think he has tried to become like more masculine with his aesthetic. So I think this time around he would not strike so many people the wrong way.
I'm convinced a lot of these things are really secondary. That like most people vote based on ideology. Like yes, aesthetics matter, but it really only matters at the margins. Like we're talking like 3-5% of people, and just I think the reason
that's the margin of victory.
Well, yes, in a lot of cases in the primary, yeah. I'm just trying to say that I think the main reason that people gravitate to certain polls, like the reason people gravitated to Warren or Sanders is because they liked the policies. The reason people gravitated to Biden is because they liked the policies. When you look at how centrists voted in the primary, right, they all voted for Biden, like 90% of them or something. There's just, it's mostly ideological assortment in a big tent. I think the aesthetic stuff is important, but it's like mostly secondary to the real consideration, which is about ideology or the appearance of ideology. And I will give credence to that voters can't have a perfect idea of how someone is ideologically speaking, in part because people change their politics. Go ahead.
We've been going for 30 minutes on this. We've got other topics to cover. So I think it's probably a good time for closing thoughts on the Veep stakes. I think that we've made it clear. I think the best, most strategic pick is Whitmer. I think the most likely pick is Mark Kelly, and that's the last thing that we can end on. Who do you guys think is the most likely pick given the current reporting, Micah and SDL, and then we can end it out.
I started with Mark Kelly. That was my initial prediction as soon as the Veep stakes started, and I'm sticking to it.
Okay, Mark Kelly. We have 2 for Mark Kelly. SDL, who's the most likely in your opinion?
I have no idea.
Give a guess.
I mean,
it was leaked today that they narrowed it down to 3. It was Tim Walsh, Josh Shapiro, and Mark Kelly.
But I can't tell whether that leak is real, right?
Disputed.
I can't tell whether that leak is real. I can't tell whether that leak is real, right?
But there was one Bloomberg and one MSNBC, and I think the difference was one listed Mark Kelly as in the final 3, and the other one listed Roy Cooper, I think.
Yeah, so I was just I'm actually of the opinion that we have no idea, and that all those leaks are more likely staffers who lean a certain way who want to narrow the list in their direction. So I want to take like a completely agnostic position that we have no idea what's going on in Ms. Harris's delightful prosecutorial
make
brain.
a prediction. Make a prediction.
Cringe alert.
My God. Fine, I'll predict Mark Kelly, and I'll be a little mad about it because he's a writer that I like.
There we go. All right.
So do we all predict Mark Kelly?
Yes.
Most likely, yes.
Mark Kelly prediction.
Most likely, we say
the
Mark
3
Kelly.
Wonks prediction. Mark Kelly. Let's see how much we understand politics, folks.
Let's see.
Okay, but have you ever seen the I'm totally forgetting the name of it, the Economist survey, where they first ask your position and then to rate like 1 to 10 how confident you are in that position? I'm like taking the Mark Kelly position and putting a 0 on the confidence scale.
Yeah, I'm not particular. Like I would say he has like the plurality odds, but I'm not. I would bet $1 that it'll be Mark Kelly. Just like a little, just slight bit of confidence in it, because you're right. Like there's so many moving parts, and you never ultimately know who will be picked. But if I had to pick somebody, definitely, I think Mark Kelly's probably the most likely. All right, let's move on to our next topic of the day. Let me kick off the segment recording real quick. All right. Project 2025. It is a banger of a topic, if you ask me. We put it as an audience poll. We kind of just assumed people would vote for it because we had some chatters and various audience members asking for it. But our Patreon said, no, we don't give a shit about Project 2025. I think it got literally 0 votes. However, we think it's a good topic, so we went ahead and did the audience topic on the back end like we normally do, and we just decided to go ahead and do Project 2025. We just did the Republican platform. Project 2025 is about 1,000 times more in-depth and specific than the actual Republican platform. Project 2025 is about 1,000 pages. The actual Republican platform is about 16 or 17 or something like that. There's way more in Project 2025. And by all accounts, the relationship between the architects of Project 2025 and the Trump campaign is relatively deep and extensive. And so there's probably reason to believe that at least a significant portion of Project 2025 will be implemented, will be supported by the incoming Trump administration if he wins. And so let's talk about some of these policies and maybe talk about a bit more of an overview. Micah, what is Project 2025 and why is everyone talking about it so gosh darn much?
So Project 2025 is this huge 922 policy document, 922 page policy document. God, I can't speak. And it's put together by the Heritage Foundation along with many, many other big conservative organizations like Turning Point USA. Some of these organizations themselves are directly affiliated with the Trump campaign are receiving contracts to perform some of the campaign's activities, like knocking on doors, like registering voters and the like. The policy document was led by former Trump staffers, and in marketing for this policy document and the policies it consists of, some current Trump campaign senior officials appear in the videos. Also, one of its authors wrote the foreword for J.D. Vance's recently published book, and Trump at the RNC pointed out one of the authors of this document and talked extensively about how great they are. And he's also committed to appointing some of these people to his administration. So there's deep connections. And what has caused so much outrage and uproar is that these 922 pages are filled with some of the most extreme, unpopular, and insane proposals we've ever seen floated relating to any sort of presidential campaign.
Yeah, it's very extreme. A lot of it, and we'll get into it. Essentially, the crux of this is we're going to be talking about some of the most bombastic things about Project 2025 that are in here. STL, sounded like you had something to say.
Yeah, just before we move off on this point, Trump has tried to deny his connection to Project 2025, which is ridiculous when basically every intellectual conservative, like, of those, half of them put their name on Project 2025. So where the hell else is he going to get his policy proposals from? In 2016, when he won, where did he get his policy proposals from? Heritage. Where did he get his staffers from? Heritage. 2/3 of the authors, each of the section is written by one guy in Project 2025. It's like a section on labor policy, and it's written by Bob Bobson or whatever. And Bob Bobson was Trump's Secretary of Labor. 2/3 of the authors of those sections come directly from the Trump administration. So he claimed, like, I don't know, I don't even know what it is. I wish them good luck. I have no idea what's in it. Like, he's either a moron or lying. So it's your pick as to which, or both.
And he was just recently on Fox News. They asked him about Project 2025 again so that he could deny it. But he made the huge mistake of saying, well, it's pretty right wing, it's pretty radical, but there's a lot of good ideas in there. I'm just going to say there's a lot of good ideas in there.
He can't even be consistent. Like, the idea, this implies that between those periods, he sat down and read through it and was like, this is pretty good, actually. Like, because again, that implies, is he an idiot or is he lying?
Yeah. I think
the main reason I wanted to mention this is Trump is trying to deny this because Project 2025, if you trust the polls, which I don't, but if you trust the polls as being broadly accurate, it's one of the most unpopular things that you can ask people about. It's like 45% disapprove, 10% approve, which is what you get for killing puppies. It's really bad.
Yeah, I think that what STL said is important to note because whether you take the view that Trump is lying, so for instance, in one scenario, Trump is lying and he actually just wants to implement Project 2025 himself, or you take the view that he's stupid, we kind of end up in the same universe because if he's stupid, well, guess what? There's so many conservatives and broad buy-in to this Project 2025. Those are the people that are going to be ultimately the policy agents in Trump's administration anyway. Right? So whether or not Trump is just oblivious to what's going on around him or he purposefully wants to implement Project 2025, a lot of these things are going to get a lot of mainstream talking time. They're going to be slipped into a lot of bills and budgets that get passed by the incoming Trump administration. Of course, no president gets their entire platform done. But as we will discuss, if you took 5% of Project 2025's policies at random, it's 5% pretty bad stuff. And so we'll talk about that in this next section. So we kind of have this general guidance of picking one or two things that are out of Project 2025 to really highlight. I guess let's start with STL. It looks like you have probably the most written here. STL, what are some things in Project 2025? We've described kind of what it is. It's just basically a giant policy docket, about 1,000 pages long, of various conservative reforms and policies. Let's say contemporary conservative reforms and policies. Sort of Trumpian style reforms and policies. Like one of the things they mentioned is reciprocal trade tariffs. For instance, of course. So what are some of the things from the Project 2025 document that you would say are particularly disastrous or that are just worth pointing out?
So the obvious one that has the most anti-democratic and anti-small r Republican consequences in this whole document is called the Schedule F plan. So, the United States has long been founded for like 150 years now on the independent, merit-based civil service, just like virtually every other civil service in the world. And the reason is that you need that to work. If you just have political appointments, the civil service becomes a loyalty scheme. It becomes a way of giving your supporters high dollar salaries so they can be as loyal to your policies as they want, even though they're a fucking moron. We saw under Trump at the senior level that fucking morons got put in charge of everything. Who was the guy put in charge of DOE? It was, oh my god, I'm so his name. She was Department of Education. Sorry, you're thinking of DO Ed.
Yeah.
I know it has an annoying name. Yeah, DO Ed, the Department of Energy.
Rick Perry.
Yeah, Rick Perry, this fucking moron who like barely got through college.
He had a D average.
Do you know who was put in charge of DOE under Obama? A nuclear fucking physicist. Do you know who was under Bush? A nuclear fucking physicist. Do you know who was before then? Also a nuclear fucking physicist. Like 3 in a row. And then we get Rick goddamn Perry because he's a moron, but he's a loyal moron. And so what I'm trying to get is that the spoil system or the loyalty system is just a terrible way to get good leadership. Rick Perry, just to give, I know this sounds like a minor example. One of the biggest things that the DOE does is it takes care of these gigantic underground nuclear spills that the United States has caused. And I don't know how to exaggerate this. During nuclear testing, we put like tons of highly radioactive material into the ground in like upstate Washington. It's right next to the Puget Sound River. And it's slowly sliding towards that river. And so as it gets there, it will start contaminating the water supply for like 4 million people. And one of DOE's policies is to take care of the gigantic underground stalagmite of radioactive material and push it the other direction. Rick Perry wrote a budget report calling for that to be cut. So I'm just like, this isn't like they want to like, they don't believe in global like climate warming or anything. They want radiation in your water. I really can't exaggerate this enough. This isn't like, they want more nuclear fuel. They want spent radioactive material sliding into your water supply. So I was trying to get at all this because it relates to the idea of Schedule F. So that was one guy in a senior executive position and how bad it could have been if he got what he wanted, that we would have killed everyone in Washington pretty much. Right? Like that's insane.
It's so funny that you're like, it's like unironically, he wanted to irradiate the whole state of Washington's water.
No,
and that was actually a real thing.
It's actually deranged. I don't know how I feel like I cannot exaggerate this. And that's one guy. So Trump, currently there are about 4,000 positions, which are political appointments, and they're usually like the secretary and the undersecretary, and maybe within each like sub-department, like the leader and the sub-leader of that. So there's only about 4,000. Trump wants to expand that. I've heard various numbers from like 20,000 to 200,000 to become political appointees under something called Schedule F. So rather than being a merit-based person who rises through the civil service, like going up in a grade, up in a grade, up in a grade, like rising through like any other corporation, you would just be directly appointed by Donald Trump. So I think I've made clear why that's a problem, because one, he's gonna appoint fucking morons and they're gonna mismanage the country. DOE's in charge of like not only nuclear waste, but nuclear energy, everything else. And this is an example of who he appointed to be in charge of literally the nuclear stockpile and fusion research. Anyway, imagine that, but 4 layers down, as if you were in a company and every single person, like 4 layers down from management to like sub-management to your project lead, every single person was appointed by the company's boss's son. And then you have an idea of how ridiculous this is. In addition, the second concern is around loyalty. So let's say Trump does want to do things which are unconstitutional or just deeply fucking evil. Like he wants to deport, say, 11 million undocumented residents and doesn't want anyone in the civil service to oppose that. Well, fortunately, he can just fire everyone who disagrees and replace him with a manager who agrees with him. Let's say that he wants to contest the 2028 ballot results. Well, now he has control of the entire civil service. So who's gonna stop him? So the concern is twofold. One is that there's a decent chance that the mismanagement of the massive federal bureaucracy could literally kill you. And two, there's a decent chance that it actually does help America slide into like illiberalism away from the democratic republic.
Yeah, it's definitely pretty scary stuff. I think I want to say that it isn't technically what Schedule F is making the federal employees at will so you can just like fire and replace them as you want. Isn't that sort of technically speaking what Schedule F is?
That's more mechanically how it works. Yes, that a lot more people are at will of the president to be hired and fired.
Exactly. Yeah, and we have unfortunately a Supreme Court who seems to, I think literally basically just said that like, yeah, the president can basically just do whatever he wants within the bounds of the executive branch. So there's really nothing stopping President Trump from implementing that policy at the very least, which is, of course, very, very scary. Micah, any thoughts?
Well, I mean, there's just a lot of really insane stuff in there. I mean, some of it's just the normal kind of right-wing economics, which, has been with the Heritage Foundation for a long time, but they've kind of moved to a more nationalist and authoritarian perspective. And it's interesting how you can see like the clash of different parts of Heritage in this document. For instance, there's a section on the case for fair trade. By fair trade, they mean protectionism, more tariffs, more import restrictions, leaving trade deals, destroying international institutions which facilitate trade. But there's also a section right after that called the case for free trade, where somebody presents a completely contradictory policy arrangement. So that's an interesting thing to note. But one thing is that I found remarkable is the complete and total prohibition of pornography. I believe this is somewhere around page 5. They want to ban pornography, and they want any sort of librarian or public employee which is distributing what they call pornographic material. That's any material really with any sort of sexual content whatsoever, to be registered as a sex offender. We're gonna see book bans on a scale you've never seen before. I think another interesting point is ending no-fault divorce. The notion that you would need to go prove to the government why you had reason to have a divorce. So you're not just permitted to sever that legal relationship whenever you wish. That is incredibly authoritarian. And I mean, I feel like there's a huge number of things like this. For instance, reversing the FDA approval of mifepristone, a very commonly used, basically abortion medication. Trump, with this policy of being able to basically fire any single person in the executive branch that he wants, could just tell the FDA, hey, reverse your approval. And if they said no, he could just go fire everybody, the person who said no, and replace them with someone who said yes. And that's why it's so scary, because it's not enough to just make sure Trump doesn't get a trifecta in Congress to stop him. Their explicit project is expanding executive power dramatically and legislating through the executive, through the decree of the president, not using the legislative process.
Yeah.
I wanted to speak briefly on two things. One is that Project 2025 itself does not explicitly call for ending no-fault divorce. Instead, it's that like a third of the contributors to Project 2025 have expressed that opinion elsewhere. Like it's a weirdly common belief among the writers of Project 2025.
Interesting.
But I want to be. It is like an actually completely insane position. Like to be clear. And two was just I wanted to read the exact text on the porn ban just because it's an example of how extreme the rhetoric has gotten from the Republican Party. Quote, pornography should be outlawed. The people who produce it and distribute it should be imprisoned. So every sex worker in this country should be jailed. Educators and public librarians who purvey it, which means provide it, should be classed as registered sex offenders. And this is the last bit. And telecommunications and technology firms that facilitate its spread should be shuttered. So this is just it's something that we didn't see in previous GOP platforms, but they're just randomly like, hey, yes, we want to ban this. Everyone who does it should be in jail, and everyone who gives it to anyone else is a sex offender. And to be clear, the reason that they targeted educators and public librarians is they want to imprison anyone who gives your kid like a pro-gay book and call them a sex offender. Like that's the implicit subtext of this, that one of their maximalist goals is kicking all the gay and pro-gay people out of education out. Like, I know that's maybe reading it into a bit much, but that's what they've been arguing at the state level for years now, that, hey, if you provide this book, which describes like gay sex acts to a child of like 14, well, then you are a sex offender. And they just want to make that federal policy. That's completely fucking insane. Like, I'm sorry. People can, in fact, read their shitty YA novels that include sexual acts and not turn out to be deeply harmed by that. Like, I'm sorry. That's not the problem facing America's youth.
Yeah, unfortunately, it does seem like a lot of these like anti-pornography type, advocates are really just interested in ending depictions of, gay relationships and things like that, where
it's like, when a gay couple is kissing, that's very political, and we should keep that out of the classroom and this kind of thing. And it's like, I don't know. I mean, it doesn't seem like that big of a deal if you represent gay relationships, or if you have sort of gay inclusive sex education. That doesn't seem like the most unbelievable thing, but unfortunately, yeah, you end up with these radical conservatives who think that that's a horrible thing to do, of course. And of course, what that ends up, the end result of that is basically that just like kids that grow up and turn out to be gay are just like less informed than kids that grow up and turn out to be straight, right? And there's some intricacies between like gay and straight sex that are probably important to inform kids of as they grow older and you get more sophisticated in your sex education. And yeah, it's just kind of it's all kind of ridiculous. Mike, it looks like you had something to say.
Well, I mean, there's just so many like minor bad things in here that really add up, right? Like using the Comstock Act to prosecute people who send abortion pills in the mail, using federal money to attempt to coerce states into policing the movement of women across state lines for abortions. I mean, this is literally restricting the free movement of women on the basis that they might be trying to get an abortion. Eliminating federal support for stem cell and fetal cell research. One of the most scary things is increasing the politicization of the Department of Justice. It's really interesting the Republican Party has seemed so concerned with Biden weaponizing the DOJ against them. And they've really called this out as it's such a terrible thing, despite the fact that it's not occurring, while also proposing simultaneously that it actually should be explicitly politicized. That we should just bring it out of the open. The president should be able to use the DOJ as his department of thuggery to use as a cudgel against his political opponents. And this is the kind of stuff that takes you from a liberal democracy into a declining authoritarian democracy, or maybe not even a democracy at all. This is the kind of stuff that happened in countries like Hungary when they went from what really was a system with free and fair elections to a system where there might be elections, but they're not so free and they're not so fair because the state is being used to help the incumbents in power.
Exactly. Some of the stuff that I wanted to point out specifically, so I tried to think of like in terms of magnitude, like what are the worst things in this document if they were to be implemented. So one of the things from Project 2025, quote, support the repeal of massive spending bills like the Infrastructure Investments and Job Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, right? So they want to get rid of like hundreds of billions of dollars of additional spending on infrastructure. I think America is rated as having like some of the worst, like most poorly maintained infrastructure in the entire developed world. The Infrastructure and Jobs Act wasn't just like, we want to just throw a bunch of icing on the cake that we don't need. Like we really, really needed a lot more public investment in infrastructure. Not only is it good for the economy and jobs, of course, but it's not like the government just giving a bunch of jobs out. We're paying people to dig holes. Like we're paying people to do basically underinvested in activities that we need investment in. It's not good when bridges collapse and roads are in complete decay. I remember 10 years ago.
Admits that he's not a true radical urbanist. Okay, look, once the highway system collapses, people will abandon their cars.
Well, our sidewalks are in decay. All of any walking infrastructure we have is in decay as well. I remember 10 years ago listening to a local politician running for office saying that certain streets in Houston looked like they got carpet bombed. Guess what? They still look like that. And hopefully this infrastructure spending can trickle down into a way that I can see it. But it's just led to so much investment across the whole country that we desperately need. That's not to mention the IRA. They're talking about repealing the IRA. Now, what was in the IRA? The three provisions that people really talk about. Number one, and I'll go in order of maybe least importance. Number one was the minimum tax on corporations that a lot of progressives and like left of center people liked. They're talking about getting rid of that. They're talking about getting rid of drug negotiation. They have whole screeds in this document talking about how the federal government should not be negotiating for drug prices. Fuck the fact that every other country with centralized healthcare system does the same thing. The federal government shouldn't be in the business of negotiating for drug prices. Paying thousands and thousands of dollars a month for your medication, A-OK, according to Project 2025. In fact, that's how it should be if you ask the people who framed Project 2025. And then that's not to mention the biggest thing
on here, which is the IRA was the largest, most globally impactful investment in climate change in the history of the world. Okay, that is not an exaggeration. That is not, memeing around. It does legitimately seem to be like the most impactful investment in climate change in like history. Hundreds of billions of dollars over the course of the pivotal decade that we live in currently, until I think the subsidies begin to expire, I think in the early 2030s. That's all really, really important, obviously. It was a diverse investment into things like solar, wind, hydrogen, carbon capture, all of these things to try and spur investment in climate change. And they want to essentially just completely get rid of that. And they go one step further. They say, to the extent that the IRA cannot be repealed, it should be up to the states. So we should take all the investment from the IRA, and what should we do? We should block grant it out to the states. That way, Republican states don't do shit about climate change, and Democratic states do everything about climate change. That is, of course, a terrible way to manage it. But here's the last thing that I'll mention. That kind of defederalization is everywhere in this document. They basically say throughout the entire document, hey, if you can't get the full repeal of like all welfare programs, just block them all out to the states. Let's trust the states to handle this. I'll call out Medicaid specifically. They talk about when it comes to or I'll talk about Medicaid later, but they talk about block granting stuff out to the states throughout this entire document, which has led to essentially a quasi cut in our welfare state ever since Bill Clinton did it in the 90s. The last thing that I'll mention is about Medicaid specifically. I think that this is the worst example of some of the stuff that they're talking about with regards to the welfare state. So they have this entire screed in Project 2025 about holding states accountable for improper eligibility determinations. They talk about requiring more robust eligibility determinations for Medicaid, and they also talk about strengthening the asset test determinations within Medicaid. All of those things, basically translated for you, we just want to means test even harder to get on Medicaid. What is Medicaid? Medicaid is a government insurance program for really poor people, right? It is not easy to get on Medicaid because you have to be pretty poor. Even in a state with Medicaid expansion, I think you have to, like the equivalent would be like you have to make like, $30,000-$40,000 a year or below in order to be eligible for Medicaid, even in an expanded state. You have to be pretty low income to qualify for Medicaid. And in states where they haven't expanded Medicaid because they're stupid and they want people to live in poverty, like in my state of Texas, you have to be even more crazily poor to qualify for Medicaid. You have to be super duper dirt poor to qualify for Medicaid. Project 2025 wants to double down on that and make it even harder for poor people to access the healthcare that they need. And I think that these are some of the biggest things, basically getting rid of a ton of infrastructure and climate investment and making it even harder for poor people to get by in terms of their healthcare access. It's just a lot of terrible stuff like that. There we go.
There's
Drop
also
the
a lot of wonk stuff that I think that we should know, but talk about else does, because I think, for instance, the central bank, right? Not really a highly polling issue. They want to make some pretty dramatic reforms to the central bank. For starters, they don't want the central bank to be concerned whatsoever with employment. They want to limit the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve. And the balance sheet is important because essentially the central bank, in order to stimulate the economy whenever demand is not sufficiently high, it purchases bonds, injecting more money into the monetary system, lowering interest rates and leading to more aggregate spending. They want to put legislative congressional limits on the size of the central bank's balance sheet and have them take a policy of reducing their balance sheet, basically selling off these assets, having people buy them from them, and basically deleting all the money that they receive from the sale of these assets. And so essentially they want an explicitly deflationary demand out of the economy, so much so that almost certainly we would just suffer an immediate recession if the central bank was to take this position. Interest rates would continue to rise, which is interesting because Trump has talked very extensively about how terrible it is that interest rates are so high. Well, their policy is to make interest rates much higher than it is, make interest rates at all times higher than they would be, and have the central bank simply sit on its hands in periods of mass unemployment, do absolutely nothing whatsoever, and I suppose just wait and see until deflation naturally subsides. But as John Maynard Keynes once famously said, we're all dead in the long run. The proper response to the Great Depression was not doing nothing. It was doing a hell of a lot of something. That is what's necessary to fight recessions. And that was the central mistake that we made in 2008. And it's widely agreed on by monetary economists, actually serious people that are not right-wing ideologues. The central bank and the federal government should have had a stronger response. So whenever the financial crisis occurred, we could have escaped our economic downturn faster. This would probably be one of the singular most economically catastrophic policies they have, because next time we slip into a recession, actually, this would probably just instantly create one, we would not be able to have the tools to even escape it. They also entertain the idea of just getting rid of the central bank itself, which I'm skeptical that would happen. But if it was to happen, their dream, depending on the specific proposal they went for, that could be even more crazy. For instance, if we switch to the gold standard, that would mean that the entire transfer, like we would see a mass transfer of all existing wealth that's currently held in dollars to everybody who currently owns gold. Everybody who currently holds gold would become enormously more wealthy at the expense of everybody else. Also, it would remove the ability whatsoever for us to try to control the money supply in a dynamic way, because the money supply would be pegged to how much gold we discover. So if one day we discover a huge reservoir of gold, we discover crazy amounts of gold, we would suffer very high levels of inflation. And if we're in a great recession and the economy is doing terrible, well, you better go get mining. So somebody better go find some gold right freaking now, so that we can escape this economic situation. So yeah, they have some very, very radical views on
Yeah, I mean,
monetary policy.
if you had to summarize Project 2025, it's like if you think like, what are the most radical elements of all, like the entire big tent of the contemporary conservative movement, and you took all of those compartmentalized radical elements and put them onto one platform. Like, who are the most crazy socially conservative people and what do they believe? Let's put that all on our platform. Who are the most crazily conservative economic people? Let's put all of that on our platform. Who are the most crazily conservative people when it comes to the welfare state and how we should organize state capacity? Let's put that on our platform. It's an unbelievable platform if you really think about all the radical things that would be included. And there's a reason why it's so unpopular. There's a reason why Donald Trump doesn't want to talk about this anymore. Even the president of the Heritage Foundation, he had to come out and say, "Oh yeah, like Trump doesn't talk about it probably for political reasons. Like he knows that he probably can't talk about this," which is one of the preeminent authors of this document saying, "Oh yeah, we know that this is incredibly unpopular. We know that it is. We know that people don't want this. And we know that people don't want it to such an extent that we know strategically we should not talk about it." That is like the goal of Project 2025 at this point. We don't want people to really talk about it. We just kind of want this to slide under the radar until we get into office. And then we can implement some portion of what we're talking about, if not the entire thing. SDL, what were you going to say?
No, I wanted to quote briefly from the section on banking. So Micah is right. The Project 2025 sort of proposes three possible reforms to banking. One is that you restrict the Fed by selling off its assets and removing any mandates around employment. Its only mandate would be inflation. So that's like the one restrictive view. The second is that they want to abolish the Fed. So I just wanted to quote it. It would, quote, effectively abolish the Federal Reserve and replace it with, quote, free banking, where, quote, neither interest rates nor the supply of money is, quote, controlled by government. And they actually point to a historical example in 1825 to the 1850s where private banks were in charge of a significant amount of U.S. money supply. And go ahead.
There'd be competing private currencies. That's the idea.
Well, that's the idea is that then you basically have competing private currencies, which is fucking ridiculous. Like, I'm sorry, that period in U.S. history was notorious for bank failure, and those bank failures leaving people who had currency in like Bank A notes. Well, now Bank A is dead, so you've got no fucking money because everyone doesn't want Bank A notes, and you can't go to Bank B because it's literally a different kind of money. Like they're pointing to one of the periods which was the worst kind of banking in U.S. history.
The pre-central bank. The pre-central bank period of U.S. history, like STL said, was marred by financial crisis after financial crisis after financial crisis after financial crisis.
Literally every decade, without exaggeration.
Whereas when we start implementing a stronger Federal Reserve and a stronger fiscal state after the Great Depression, what do we see? We go like 80 years without a financial crisis. We do have one in 2008, but then we did a lot more regulations. And then since then, even throughout the COVID recession, we were able to achieve a soft landing. It seems like we're starting to really fine tune this whole financial system and really avoid financial recessions. That's not with less government involvement. It's with more government involvement, right? Micah?
Well, so what I'll say is, I think commodity-based currency, that is the most insane idea. That's an objectively terrible idea.
Gold standard, which is even more ridiculous than abolishing.
They have NGDP targeting in there, which that's actually my position. But I know that they're not actually going to do any currency switch. The real thing that we'll get with them is this monetary policy central bank micromanagement by Congress, which is terrible. In terms of free banking, people say, I know some really smart monetary economists, which are proponents of free banking, and they say that the reason why we had so many financial crises back then is because there was like branching regulations that like didn't allow the banks to reach like this sort of scale that was required for this to work. And they point to like Iceland where they had free banking and everything was cool. I'm pretty skeptical. I also think that just the level of destabilization from like switching currencies, like getting rid of the US dollar, would seem frankly very, very problematic. I have no idea what that would do to national deficit situation. I don't even know how that could possibly work. And I also think one of the biggest issues with the free banking idea is this idea that we'd have our economy.
Oh no. What would we have our economy? We'll never find out.
What's that?
You cut out,
Micah.
Micah.
For a bit. Please go ahead.
I think there's this really strange assumption that people would tolerate multiple different currencies being used in the economy. I think that would make economic planning and calculation very difficult. I think people like having a standardized unit of currency, and so there might be a tendency for people to all switch to one private currency, which would be extraordinarily problematic to have a private monopoly on currency creation.
No, I wanted to speak to this a bit because like the US is still the reserve currency. People always are talking about like people from every political side,
Bricks,
right, left, and center, will yap about the
Bricks.
decline of the US dollar. And it's not fucking happening. When you look at like the percentage of international financial transactions done in XYZ currency, it's always the fucking dollar. And various other currencies have risen and fallen. Like I believe it's like the Chinese yen has fallen a bit, and the Japanese, sorry, the Chinese is it the yuan? Am I going insane?
Renminbi.
Sorry, I don't know why I was confusing those. Like that's risen up a bit, but those are all marginal at like 20% or less, and it's like 80% the US dollar. We are lucky actually as a country to basically get seniorage from other countries wanting to buy dollars and use them to trade in it because they trust us to have a stable enough currency. We are literally just getting free money from everyone else in the world because we have such a nice currency. And the Republican proposal is to get rid of that because they don't like the Fed existing and they are mad at the idea of inflation happening. And like that is not an exaggeration. They are just mad that prices go up, and that's it. That's where the economic theory stops. I'm like 100% convinced that this is the reason it's in a goddamn Republican proposal.
I had a short debate with it was actually before we recorded Live and Learn yesterday, my other illustrious podcast, with an Austrian type who was saying, well, Econo Boy, if you're right, why has the dollar lost 97% of its value? And I'm like, well, if we think about that, the wages have gone up and your purchasing power as a person's actually gone up. The dollar as a unit has probably gone down, but really I care about what people can buy. And he's like, but how can you be right if 97% of the dollar has lost its value? And it's like, dude, what are you? Are you a fucking Austrian AI? Like, are you unable to understand, like, these concepts that we're talking about here, that we care more about the purchasing power of people and households over an individual dollar's ability to buy things. Like, that's not the important thing here. Obviously, the more important thing is, of course, what people can actually buy. But unfortunately, yeah, there is this weird, this almost, this like dogmatic thought process of like, oh, well, if prices go up, that is bad. And when prices go down, that is good. And the thing that causes prices to go up is when money gets printed, right? Which isn't even true either, right? And so it's quite it's quite bizarre that Austrian economics has maintained such a niche in conservative political spaces over time, when it seems like literally every country on the planet has basically moved to a kind of a Keynesian governing model with central banking and fiscal stimulus. So
just to speak to, we were sort of listing what would be the worst policies in Project 2025. So like, I think the central bank policy would definitely be up there. It's not in Project 2025 explicitly, but I think that the central bank policy as a shock to the US economy would be as bad as like the tariff policy. Like the shock from increased uncertainty of like just destroying whatever value the dollar had would be as large or larger than a 10% tariff on all foreign goods. Like it's ridiculous that they even put it in there, and they highlighted it. Like they have these little section heads for each of they have like chapters and sub-chapters. In their fucking section head, they're quoting like heaping praise on this guy for wanting to abolish the Fed. It's like that. I feel like I'm going insane. Why have like the 1850s made a return in the fucking Republican policy document?
This is really, we talk about this a lot, how like we support a lot of efficient policies like tax reform, regulatory reform, and the impacts are kind of marginal, like 2-3% impact on GDP. And then it's just like occasionally there's these policies that if you mess them up, like just immediate Great Depression.
Right.
And the Republican policy these days is like, you'll have some, deregulations and tax reforms that make sense here and there. And there's just like every single massive hammer they could take to the face of the American economy they support.
Like, it's ridiculous. Probably the one, we talked about a lot of really bad ones. I think the worst one is Schedule F, but if we had to do a number 2, it would just be the more general approach to environmental regulation. They want to remove, for example, the ability of the EPA to regulate carbon. No longer can the cost of carbon be considered in any of the EPA's considerations around regulation. So that means that stuff like mileage standards, well, you can't care about carbon. And so that's just, I'm sorry, this is just ridiculous and anti-science at this point. Most of the people who wrote Project 2025 take the now standard Republican position that climate change is happening, but it's not humans' fault. And I just love the goddamn progression on this. First, it wasn't happening, it's not heating up, and now we're at the, it's heating up and I can't ignore it stage, but it's clearly not our fault. And when it is our fault, well, there's nothing we could have done about it. That's going to be the position in 10 goddamn years, and you can call me on it. In fact, that's what in 2032, the Republican policy document is going to blame China for global warming. I guarantee it. That's the next switch that's going to happen.
Yeah, and what STL I think is referencing is that I think this was part of the Biden administration's EPA policy, was to come in and say that, hey, look, carbon isn't just like a thing that we admit and it heats the earth. Like, there's an entire downstream physical, material, social cost to carbon, right? That pollution, it's not just that you, I don't know, pollute a river and now we don't have a nice river to swim in. It's like you pollute a river and people get more sick because their water's polluted, right? And people have some sort of social loss of community because they can't swim and hang out with everybody in the river like they used to. Like, there's material cost to pollution, and this has been what left-leaning people across the globe have tried to adopt in their rhetoric, is like, the climate emergency is real, obviously, but also that pollution itself has an actual cost that needs to be paid. Pollution is an externality, and it needs to be internalized in these production processes.
I've been really pleased to see actually a return to a focus on the cost of pollution, like on particulate matter, which seems to be now a very mainstream talking point, that, hey, inhaling like soot actually hurts people. And I think there's some estimate that like 1 in 8 deaths are caused by basically inhaling soot. And so like there's a real, I'm saying soot, but soot's actually too big. We're talking about tiny particulate matter. They're different, but call it soot because it's funny. And so I've been very pleased to see that. And this is like an exact reversal of that. It's like, no, pollution just goes up into the air and it just hangs out up there. Like, that is unironically the overall position of the Republican, like on every possible case. One example I wanted to point to of like an incredibly disastrous regulation, in terms of climate and more broadly, quote, states would be prevented from adopting stricter regulations on vehicle emissions as the state of California has. So one of the things they want to do is like so this is what frustrates me. They talk about states' rights until it comes to regulating cars. Like this is one of those things. It's so obvious that they just want to do states' rights until they have enough power. It's states' rights on abortion until they can get a federal abortion ban. It's states' rights on vehicle emission standards until they can get enough power, and then they want to push you goddamn down because you are going to drive the gas guzzler that gets 10 miles per gallon. You will drive the SUV. You will live in the death box on your way to and from work every single day. And so I bring it up because, again, it's a sign that the Republican Party does not care about stuff like states' rights. It only cares about pursuit of power and maximizing its policy agenda, like with Schedule 8. And I think that's really scary from a secondary perspective. Like, first off, their regulations are all insane, in my opinion. But second off, like, they want to impose them and not allow people to reject them. That, like, Trump today, someone in chat was mentioning this, he quote unquote joked about people not needing to vote after 4 years of a Trump presidency. Like, that he's going to fix it so good you'll never need to vote again. And the idea that you can vote about that you can joke about that kind of shit is actually insane to me. As the president of a democracy, you can be like, yeah, you won't need democracy after this one. What the fuck are you talking about? This democracy is older than you and it will outlive you. And if you don't believe that, you shouldn't deserve to lead our country.
Accelerationist
right.
Econoboy says, I dare you to implement this, Republicans, because you will be an extinct political party come the next election, assuming we last that long, if you ask me. Micah, what were you going to say?
Well, you would think that, right? Like, you would think after January 6th, they would be extinct. You would think after overturning Roe v. Wade, they would be extinct. But the American public and the forces of polarization have a really interesting tendency to split us 50-50, no matter how far right they move. And
Micah, there's no way.
How the center we move.
At a certain point, you're broken out of the fog that is the MAGA Republicans' mind. When you're surrounded by fucking, when pollution runs rampant and like half of the fucking water supply of the country is polluted, when there's a great fucking depression because they've gotten rid of the Federal Reserve, when you can't use your dollars anymore because it's backed by gold, but also we have this weird free banking complicated system, when like porn is banned, when you ban pornography, and so many people are like, how could you do this? Like, what are you doing? If they ban
porn, they're going to lose the Hawk Tuah vote, which was clearly very important.
Yeah, like
you're banning porn. I mean, their base is largely men, and especially like working class men and increasingly young men. That is certainly like absolutely a huge vote loser. But there's a lot of
you don't know that's true. They could all be into edging.
Yeah. I think.
I'm sorry.
There's a lot of voter suppression stuff in here, which is very problematic. The Republicans are not just pro-election security. They're anti-people voting. They just try to get a bill passed which required people to show proof of citizenship upon registering to vote. Now, if you ever worked in voter registration, you will know that would mean 99.9% of people we register, I've been a deputy registrar, would not be able to be registered because your driver's license doesn't count as a proof of citizenship. You would need to have your birth certificate or a social security card or some other ridiculous, like your passport in your back pocket. Nobody does that. Nobody does that. And the notion that that's necessary to prove that illegal aliens or immigrants are not registering to vote is ridiculous because the government has that information. Whenever people register, the government looks at their application and then it looks at the other information the government has on the person. You can't just put a random name on there and immediately now Joe whatever is registered to vote. They're going to check if you're a citizen. If you want to make that process more stringent, you point out a state where it's not as good as it should be. That is the good faith way to deal with this issue. But their mission is not election security. It is voter suppression. Another one I want to talk about, this is interesting, their Medicare reform. Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to mention there was an AP investigation into the 2016 election, like months after it had all closed down. And it's worth remembering that election counting in this country is hugely like it's hugely localized. It's not even at a state level. So a state Democrat governor, state Republican governor don't even have control. Usually each precinct, each voting precinct will have a Democrat and a Republican in any goddamn district you want, and they will be overseeing the process together, like some sort of partisan balanced team. There's 3,500 at least voting precincts all across this country or more. And across all of those, there were 200 or less cases of voter fraud or potential voter fraud, which is just the case where, like Micah's saying, you can't perfectly match someone with like government records. And of those 200 cases, about half were pro-Trump and about half were pro-Clinton. The overall effect on the election was like +5 Clinton or something. Just the margins
Like
here
really quick,
so ridiculously small.
Hold on, just to be clear,
Not
so people
5
understand,
percentage points.
5 total votes,
Yes,
not 5%. Just for
No,
people
5 votes. And also to be clear, these are spread over like 20. These were spread over like 20 states. So the effect was like +1 Hillary Clinton in Arizona. Okay, good job. And in fact, of the few prosecutions, so out of those 200 cases, only I think 9 got prosecuted. And of those 9, half were Republicans. So again, it's sort of like, yes, does voter fraud exist? Yes. It is so incredibly rare. The idea that you have to be worried about illegal residents doing it, undocumented residents doing it, is one, it's just ridiculous. And two, it seems like apparently half the undocumented residents who are doing the voter fraud love you, Mr. Trump. So what the fuck is happening there?
Another way to say what SDL is saying is not that it's not important to take voter fraud seriously. It's that our current system of dealing with voter fraud is really good. Like, we don't need a better system, essentially. We can catch all the voter fraud that exists, like, and it doesn't happen very often.
Listen, if people want to pass legislation to make voter fraud extra super crazy impossible, it's fine. But their agenda is just explicit voter suppression. I mean, these are the folks that want us to have to re-register to vote every couple of years. Right? These are the folks that want to purge people from the voter rolls, as aggressively as possible, because they just don't want people to vote. And what I think is so interesting about this is a strategy that comes out of the older Republican playbook, based on a different demographic assortment amongst the parties. I mean, their idea was, the Democrats, they're the party of the working people, the people that are lower propensity voters, and so higher turnout hurts us and helps them. But nowadays, we're actually not defending or fighting against voter fraud because it benefits us. We're fighting against it on principle, because in fact, a lot of these purges, a lot of these extra requirements hurt the exact voters which are the MAGA base. The MAGA base is the lower propensity voter, working class folks, the folks who don't show up in many of these midterm elections, primaries, and the like. This is the kind of stuff that Trump has done especially well with. We've seen incredible amounts of education polarization, such that actually these kind of policies don't really hurt us on net in many places in the way they used to. I want to talk about some specific reforms here, just to kind of illustrate the approach that this document takes. We could probably mention that Project 2025 is not like 922 pages of every single thing being wrong. There's like a lot of just anti-government, like kind of older right-wing style policy, which ends up being fine when the government's wrong. In many cases, it ends up being wrong when the government's right. Their plan for Medicare is not to abolish it, but it's to make private Medicare, the Medicare Advantage plans, the default. So whenever you turn 65, you're not enrolled in the government Medicare plan. You're forced to choose a private plan. And something that's really interesting is they want to give beneficiaries direct control of Medicare dollars. So I imagine that just means that giving people some sort of voucher. Basically, the government
they don't want to say the word voucher, but that's what they mean by that. Yeah.
And the real question is, they don't say if the voucher is risk adjusted or not. So like, if let's say you're like a disabled, type 1 diabetic, receiving cancer treatment, do you get the same amount of money as other folks, or do you get more money? And what happens if people don't use that money to enroll in insurance? What if they need to go to the hospital? Are they just on their own?
See, this is yet more proof the Republican Party is accelerationist to the left. Okay, they're looking at their old voters. They're saying, "Wow, these guys are such dependable Republican voters. We need to kill them."
There you go. That's true. No, I mean that's the thing. But that's what I mentioned before. There's just so much stuff on this platform of like how do we decentralize, defederalize, essentially the entirety of the U.S. government? They don't want to use the word voucher, but they're talking about basically turning Medicare into a voucher system, and that's obviously pretty bad, especially when, Medicare. That's another example. Like if they were to dismantle Medicare in this way, Medicare is a program that has like an 80% approval rating. People like Medicare. People who are on Medicare like it. And if you were to do these radical changes to the program, people would they wouldn't like it. Like it would be really unpopular, right? So.
Well,
I did.
one of the things they list is removing burdensome policies that micromanage Medicare Advantage plans. This is especially remarkable because I think by almost all accounts, Medicare Advantage plans are probably not regulated enough. I mean, some people are just completely anti them. I think that we can make the system work. It just is not working. And it's like, it just shows to me that these right wingers on healthcare don't seem to be interested in actually creating a more functional healthcare system. They don't seem to be like right wingers in other countries, which say, okay, how do we get universal healthcare access in some sort of market-based way? No. It's like, how do we just like take a hammer and just smash everything the government's currently doing, and we'll just hope that everything will be better after that. Ultimately, that's just a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
I mean, I strongly agree. It's very reminiscent of the attempts to repeal and replace Obamacare, where they almost managed to repeal it, but the replacement part, they never managed to even articulate a plan that they could get behind. I think it's because like the median Republican legislator doesn't actually support any kind of universal or even like almost universal healthcare.
Well, I think that the replacement
there was a plan. I made a video on this. It's called the American Care Act. I like to call it the Don't Care Act. Because it was raising people's deductibles by $2,000 or $3,000, cutting subsidies for the poor, cutting Medicaid, leaving millions and millions and millions of people without insurance, allowing greater degrees of price discrimination, basically make healthcare way more expensive for like the vast majority of people. And then for a lot of people, just take away healthcare like entirely, just no healthcare for you.
That's what it's like. They weren't going to replace Obamacare with like the market-based alternative to Obamacare, because they talked about some stuff that was interesting. Like, what about you allow multi-state competition? And I read some stuff like, that could have an effect. It might not affect. And I was like, that's kind of interesting. But their actual plan was like, what if we just cut out all the subsidies and allow more discrimination? It's like, what?
Well, what they
those were like the good, the objectively, even to a conservative, good parts of the plan.
One of the articulations of their reforms to Medicaid in 2017 was essentially to create risk pools, like Micah was describing previously, where you have some grading system and you fall into a certain grade where you get a certain amount of subsidization from the government, and that this money, I believe, was essentially a voucher that you could use, and then you could go out and take, you could purchase private insurance for it. Now, in theory, it's not that this would maybe necessarily be the most disastrous, poverty-inducing, healthcare denying policy in the world. Unfortunately, what they did, though, was that in changing the form of the subsidy, instead of going from a government insurance program to basically a subsidy with a risk-adjusted pool, they snuck in a huge cut, and this is what Micah is talking about, in the actual subsidization that you get. That if you were to compare somebody with like the same disabilities on Medicaid currently to the same person who would get the risk-adjusted subsidy in the new Republican world, they would be getting way less money, right? And I think that, in part, that's one of the reasons why Republicans, they try to change the form of these programs. It's not just because they're in favor of like pure market orientation of X, Y, and Z. It's also that in changing the form, they can confuse the conversation on what the actual material impact is going to be on people. Hey, isn't it better just to get a check for $10,000? Let's ignore the fact that your insurance costs currently are like $15,000. Like that's essentially what the form took in 2017. Yeah, Micah.
Well, actually, I think you're talking about this is the Ryan Romney plan of reintroducing risk pools, which is a more thoughtful plan. Like, Paul Ryan was a much more econ-oriented guy, a guy that I could probably respect infinitely more than I do respect like the current GOP. And he obviously had a lot to do with this healthcare reform bill as well, but it shifted in a more ridiculous direction, because their plan was to replace income-based subsidies, which cap premiums at a percentage of your income, with an age-based subsidy that's also just smaller in totality. So if you're older, if you're 65 and you're a rich person, you'd receive more subsidy than an extremely, like a pretty poor person that's young that has a disease.
Fun fact,
And it's
Paul
like, well,
Ryan.
that's really weird.
Fun fact, Paul Ryan advocated
I'm just saying, like,
Mhm.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, fun fact, Paul Ryan advocated once for the implementation of socialism. That's a true thing.
We're going
with the privatization of Social Security.
He advocated for creating essentially a wealth fund he advocated for funding Social Security fully and Medicare and taking those trust funds, converting them into social wealth funds. And I think if you did the math on like the funding increases and the sovereign wealth fund, like after so many years, 100% of all equities would be owned by the government, according to the Paul Ryan ideal, SDL.
I think it was something, it would have been like by 2040, 99% of the bond market or something would have been owned by the US state.
Based.
And it's funny because Democrats have had a knee-jerk reaction against these kind of ideas coming from Republicans, because they said that's privatization. You're going to gamble our money in the stock market. And it just shows you like how weird partisan politics can be. It's kind of like two magnets that like must, with one moves, the other one must stay a certain distance away from it. And so if Republicans take a position, Democrats almost necessarily must take the opposite.
I'm like the Wolverine meme where
like,
he's in bed and he's looking at the picture, like sad looking at the picture. And it's like Paul Ryan and Mitt Romney, like we didn't know what we were losing in 2012. The Republicans were so much less crazy in 2012 than they are today. Where have we gone?
They were.
Yeah. No, for
like,
sure.
I feel like it's a low bar.
On some social issues, they were pretty bad, but at least on economic issues, I mean, now they've just embraced like every bad economic idea. Like they mixed like the bad right wing, like, I guess laissez-faire policies, but mostly with terrible populist policies as well. Like what's worse than deregulation? How about the worst form of regulation? That actually is much worse in many cases.
Well, we're coming up on about an hour.
It's remarkable. I mean, this document is just filled with similar kinds of taking hatchet to government.
I mean, it's
trying to blow everything up.
It's 1,000 pages of radical social conservatism and right-wing economic populism, which is to say that it cuts the shit out of the welfare state and makes it significantly more inefficient than it used to be, and or just gets rid of like various positive forms of government investment and state capacity. Oh, and also the state capacity that's left over is hyper partisan and incompetent in nature, right? So it just essentially, like, if this plan was fully implemented, the United States would no longer be a superpower, and I stand by that 100%. Like, our country would be fundamentally
Boys, okay, now we should do, what's your favorite part of Project 2025? What do you agree with?
I actually tried to look at parts that I was like, okay, like, what's a part of Project 2025 that I think is good? I legitimately could not find anything. I couldn't find anything. Like, maybe you can point something out that I'm like, it could make sense. I tried to look up stuff on their, I want to say certain, like, very specific things on their unionization policy made some sense, I think I saw, but I couldn't, nothing really stood out to me that made any, and that's because it was relatively pro-union, but it was like 20 anti-union policies and then one pro-union one. I was like, oh, I guess the one pro-union one is, but I'm not sure. What do you have, Micah? I'm sure you've got some things.
So, I mean, like, I've looked through this document. I haven't read the entire thing. What you see is like, some old right wing style, like the Hoover, Institute, like free market economics bros, like have not been purged yet. And occasionally they get some stuff right. I mean, they're concerned with growth. They're concerned with controlling the deficit. They're concerned with questions of like tax efficiency and regulatory efficiency. And so, like, insofar that a tax is bad, they want to destroy taxes,
lowering the corporate
and
tax.
So some of them are bad, right?
That was one they had,
right? Yeah. And like they want to destroy regulations, and plenty of regulations are bad. And it's like, okay, well, that's where they get it right. They incidentally get it right sometimes.
I think they have.
I imagine there's some deficit stuff in here that's good as well.
I think they have
probably the most
DBCFT.
defensible one from the perspective of our podcast is the reduction in the corporate tax. Now, the problem, of course, is that they're not pairing the reduction in the corporate tax with like an increase of some other tax. They're just like, the funny thing is that the overall effect of Project 2025 would be a Great Depression, a elimination of the US dollar as a global standard, and a increase in the deficit. Like the overall effect is fiscal negative because of how much taxes they want to cut, even with all the social programs they want to cut. So it's just sort of like they would actually do the worst economic cut that a country has ever done to itself, and for no gain in national wealth. Like they're not like cutting because we have to. It's the only way out. They're just cutting because they really hate poor people. I don't know.
Yeah. I think I believe I did see them talk about a DBCFT in this document. And they did talk about lowering the corporate tax. Again, on this podcast, the only reason we don't like the corporate tax is because the alternatives to the corporate tax are much better, right? So, just like strictly getting rid of the corporate tax with like no other policy surrounding it could be a net positive, could be a net negative, but like it's just so clear that the alternatives are much better to a corporate tax. Micah, what were you going to say?
And they want to obliterate, from my understanding, itemized deductions and just like get rid of tax credits and exemptions. I mean, a lot of the exemptions should go away. A lot of deductions should go away, right? So like some of this stuff is okay. That's fine. I mean, sometimes they want to make something more market oriented and like it should be. I'm a pretty market oriented guy. I don't know. It is really interesting though, seeing like how the market ideas are like clashing with this economic populism, because American Compass is one of the organizations which is kind of spearheading this move to the worst form of economic populism you can have, which is right-wing economic populism, like protectionist stuff. And they're co-authors on this. And so it's just, I don't know. I just find it really remarkable.
No, you mentioned
kind of ideological.
You mentioned that in the free trade section, there's two proposals, one of which is like the stock standard free trade is good policy, which like, hey, I'm in favor of that. I generally think free trade is like good both economically and good for workers broadly, especially if you have free labor movement. But there's some distributional concerns. We've talked about this before. But the other one is like, it's so funny. They literally put the free trade policy, which is like standard Republican crap, next to we should have high tariffs and reciprocal tariffs and like national security tariffs and just tariffs out the wazoo on everything. And it's so like you can actually see the multiple coalitions in the Republican Party inside this document.
For sure. Well, anything else you guys wanted to talk about? STL?
One last thing that I thought was just very interesting is this document as a whole explicitly references Judeo-Christian values and says that we used to have like a God in the we used to have under Judeo-Christian values like regulation of and promotion of marriage. There's a quote in it which says, quote, Sabbath rest. God ordained the Sabbath as a day of rest. And until very recently, the Judeo-Christian tradition sought to honor that mandate by moral and legal regulation of work on that day. It's sort of remarkable that the document as a whole is not explicitly Christian nationalist. But again, we're seeing step after step in the direction of Christian nationalism, where the justification for a policy can literally just be God said so. And that I think is really worrying. Virtually every one of the authors of Project 2025 outside of the actual work of Project 2025 has said that they were motivated to write this by God. There's this quote that basically someone was trying to grill a Project 2025 author on the fact that Trump is a twice divorced, like multiple affair having person, and yet Project 2025 calls for like stronger regulation on divorce. It calls for stronger family and whatnot. Well, how do you reconcile those two? And they said, quote, we understand our Lord works with imperfect instruments, including us. And it's like, man, I actually like, I am so creeped out by you guys. You guys are so fucking weird. Jesus Christ.
Yeah, I think it was it was on Live and Learn yesterday where somebody was like one of the advantages of Governor Walz's messaging was he goes, man, because I think Governor Walz said something like in one of his interviews, he's like, man, we got to keep in mind like these guys are just weird. He said something like that, and it was like, man, this rings so true. Like we're on a bed of nails. We're the frog in the pot of boiling water. Where like Republicans have like done so many crazy things, said so many crazy things. They constantly do so many crazy things today and say so many crazy things today that we tend to lose sight of like broadly speaking just how like crazy and radical and insane a lot of leaders in the Republican Party are. And obviously MAGA conservative supporters, many of them are you know, they suffer from the same derangement. And unfortunately, there's probably most Republican voters are just willing to go along with that because of ideological reasons, and you know, they don't necessarily prioritize like competence or character or democracy, so long as it gets them, you know, things like tax cuts and deregulation, which of course is incorrect if you ask me.
But like, what I think is so crazy is they went from a position of being kind of anti-government, except for like, you know, a small selection of like religious issues, to now just being like not really anti-government whatsoever, just kind of anti-government in the progressive sense, very much totally fine with social engineering, but for their own religious purposes. I mean, like listed here is amending the Fair Labor Standards Act to encourage communal resting on the Sabbath by requiring workers be paid time and a half for hours worked on the Sabbath days. Like, they want to re-engineer society around their specific religious views, and they're totally fine using state power to do so.
Yeah, of course. I mean, Democrats talk about abortion restrictions as an example of this, right? You know, using this apparatus of the state to prevent people from getting health care, right? Obviously, they're okay doing that if it serves their, you know, their ideological narratives, or if it, you know, placates their base or whatever in some extent, which is obviously pretty crazy. We mentioned some of the anti-abortion stuff in here as well. Like this document, I don't think this document comes out and outright says we want to ban abortion, but it does like everything but, where it's like, we want to make abortion really hard to get, and we want to make the abortion pill basically illegal. And it's like, all right, well, I guess they're just not quite brave enough to say what they.
We're going to make them where
really
insurance
think.
doesn't cover it.
Right, exactly. And that's arguably one thing that's even scarier about this document, is that like they're brave enough to say all of these crazy things, but there are still some things that they're not quite brave enough to say. So there's still some chapters missing in this book that we don't quite know exactly what the radical things are that they are going to do in office if they take over. I mean, again, I mentioned this a lot because it's probably the craziest example. Trump talked about putting Stephen Miller as the Attorney General. Stephen Miller is unironically like a white nationalist, right? It's like making Nick Fuentes the Attorney General of the United States, right? I mean, it is a crazy thought that Stephen Miller would have the power of the Attorney General, and that is but one example of the type of radicalism that will come to the executive branch should Trump get a second term, potentially speaking. Obviously, this was just a sort of insider rumor pick, but I will say that reporting on the inside of campaigns has been quite robust this election cycle. It seems like pretty much all the insider reporting has come true. And so anyway, it's definitely a pretty scary preview of what's to come. Any final thoughts on this document before we move to our audience topic, gentlemen?
FYI, Stephen Miller is directly tied to Project 2025.
Another one of them. Yeah.
I take it. I don't take it seriously at all whenever people are like, "My God, this is just a right-wing attack." Like, I mean, this is just a fear-mongering, and this is just, you know, far-left propaganda. He has nothing to do with this. It's like, if you do even the slightest bit amount of critical thinking and research, the connections are like so overwhelming and so ubiquitous. But
right.
There's just no way you could possibly think that he isn't connected to this whatsoever. And even if he thinks that none of this should be implemented, we know that Trump is one of the most impressionable people with the least sophisticated policy views around. I know people who are gun rights activists who went to the White House to speak to Trump after the occurrence of a mass shooting, and they said, "We want you to ban assault weapons." And he said, "Oh, okay, sure, yeah, that sounds fine." His stance is definitely not banning assault weapons. He just does whatever people around him say. The only two things that he believes in is protectionism and mass deportations, and also maybe that like Putin's really cool. He has no sophisticated policy views on anything else.
Trump is absolutely like brain completely empty, and then whatever just filters in from the left ear from someone whispering, it just becomes his belief for the day until someone from the right ear whispers the other thing. It's
yeah, for sure. Well, that was Project 2025, guys. A bit of a scattershot approach again. There's so much in this document. I would recommend Democracy Forward's website. They did an annotated sort of preview of Project 2025. You just look up Democracy Forward and you
can find it, and they kind of talk about all the radicalism in this document, and they cite exactly in Project 2025 where it says the things that they're saying, so it's not like misleading or crazy or anything like that. Like, for the most part, what the mainstream media has reported on Project 2025 is correct. Like, it's an extremely right-wing radical document, and the hands of all sorts of conservatives are on this. It's a 1,000-page document. Like, hundreds of people probably worked on this document individually. And like Micah said, if you look at the connections between the Trump campaign staff and Project 2025, it's very clear. And obviously, Trump himself praised the work of the Heritage Foundation, praised the work of the president of the Heritage Foundation who wrote this. The Heritage Foundation president said, oh yeah, like, he knows that he can't talk about this publicly, but that's kind of the plan in that recording that got leaked before it was published. It's obviously just a lot of crazy things in this document, so I would encourage people to read about it after watching this episode, of course, and go from there. Alrighty, last up from the docket. Number one, let me shout out the audience before we go to our final segment of the day. Once again, guys, 65 likes on this stream with 45 viewers. Unbelievable. Thank you guys so much for liking the stream. It's actually crazy how awesome you guys have been with liking the stream. SDL, what were you going to say?
Just the audience is beg maxed, okay, and like build.
That's true. That's true. We are begging. We're not joking. We're begging you to like the stream. We're begging you guys, okay? Please, God, like the stream, all right? Please. But no, thanks so much for liking the stream, guys. It's definitely a big help. I think SDL said it's literally like 1 like equals 1 viewer or something. Like, it's a really big push.
It's remarkably high return. Yeah. Just one thing that someone in chat was asking, were you guys talking about how base Paul Ryan was? I think mostly we were trying to comment on comparison of them to the modern Republicans.
Relatively, yeah.
Like insofar as their agenda was deregulation has more possibility to be positive when the regulations are fucking stupid than the current Republican agenda, which is like deregulation, except when it adds on like total bans for everything they hate, like banning all restriction on climate change and carbon.
It's literally only bad regulation.
Yeah, it's
pro-regulation by the bad ones and anti-regulation by the good ones.
Yeah, in particular, the joke, I guess, that Economy was just pointing to is that Paul Ryan supported a plan which would have diverted an enormous amount of money into de facto a social wealth fund, which is just very funny for a Republican to do, right? Like, a social wealth fund is usually either a thing that oil-rich states and socialist states do. This is the only kind, and we're not oil-rich, so like, it's just very funny.
We are oil-rich.
Given that he's a deficit.
But yeah, Paul Ryan and Mitt Romney were like this vein of Republican, which was very concerned with foreign affairs and a strong defense, and that could lead them to being too hawkish, probably in places like the Middle East. But in our current context, supporting countries like Taiwan and Ukraine are the right thing to do. So we definitely prefer to have those kinds of Republicans around. They're very concerned with the deficit. The deficit is certainly a big problem. They were very concerned with pro-growth, tax reform, regulatory reform. Those are fine things to be concerned with. Their issue is, of course, they were anti-social spending, and many times anti-social spending in very negative ways, pro-work requirements, that kind of stuff, and pro tax cuts, which as paired with those policies, and socially conservative, right? So those are disagreements, but the degree of disagreement we had with folks like them is just so much smaller than the degree of disagreement we have with people like Trump, whose entire platform is just the worst possible stuff.
Still pretty big. I did just want to mention on the foreign policy note, I do feel sometimes that Trump et al. Get too much credit for being like isolationist or whatever. They're just their view of military actions is all about strength. So like, Trump is isolationist until he bombs Soleimani. He's isolationist until he pulls out of an agreement which keeps Iran from getting nuclear weapons and integrates it into the global market. Like, he's just fucking stupid actually in maintaining peace through strength. He literally just wants a strong military, and they want the strong military in part for stuff they're talking about, like invading Mexico and doing another decartelization operation, which the last time that happened, Mexico killed it was like 30,000 people or something. It was just ridiculous. It didn't fucking work.
I think
he's anti-intervention in the worst ways possible, right?
And like, pro-intervention in the worst ways possible. Yes.
Yeah. Abandon the Kurds, abandon the Taiwanese, abandon Ukraine. Hardcore support for everything Netanyahu wants to do with literally no conditions whatsoever. I think killing Soleimani was actually correct. But yeah,
Oh my
invading
God.
Mexico. As
My-
an Iranian,
Mike is
everybody
Iranian,
celebrated
yeah.
whenever Soleimani died.
Yeah, he's
Look, I'm
He
not
died
defending
like
the
a
guy.
dog. That was his best moment. I'm sorry.
It's
he
more about
died like a
it's
dog.
more about like if your goal is to try and integrate Iran into the global community and like move them away from being like an increasingly closed off like theocratic state, like everything he's done is the opposite direction of that, right? You're giving all the ammunition you need to Iranian domestic hardliners when you kill Soleimani, when you pull out of the agreement, on and on.
I don't know if Micah is
I don't think you should have pulled out the Iran nuclear deal, but Soleimani is a mass murderer.
I'm not a fan of the guy. Just there's plenty of mass murders, right? We don't kill the leaders of Saudi Arabia, like because they're an ally.
I don't know if Micah is of this stripe, but because Mike and I guess have never talked a lot about Iran, I guess, even though he's Iranian. But the Iranians that I do know that I have taught this, because my read of it is that Iranians that I've met are like very in favor of hardline policies against Iran. Like I've actually met most Iranians that I've met said, we don't want you to lift the sanctions, even though the sanctions are like absolutely hurting Iranian people. We don't want it because it hurts the government, and it puts pressure on the government. And that's kind of a surprising position. And maybe that's not like the broadly held view of Iranians, but most Iranians that I've met, at least, actually take quite a hardline stance. Yeah.
No, it definitely is. Actually, at this point, I think the majority of Iranians are Republicans because the Democrats have been perceived as very weak in Iran, and the Republicans have taken this anti-Iran stance. And so many are pro-Republican, and like I don't even know, they've just become right-wing on tons of issues now because this is the one issue that was most salient to them. So they just repolarized. And I think that part of it is that I think Democrats have done a really bad job of speaking to the Iranian people's concerns and like really messaging on them and really taking a hard stance against the government and being confrontational with Iran in the ways they need to be. But also Iranians a lot of times have this perception that like you could just like kind of beat.
Oh no.
What
are they beating?
Big Iran, okay. The IRCG came in and snipped the cord. We can't hear you. Your microphone.
Can't hear you, Micah. Well, anyway, we were getting off topic anyway. Let's move on.
Hello.
Yeah.
Oh, we can hear you now.
No. I'm going to finish what I'm saying.
Finish what you're saying,
They
Micah.
have this perception. They have this perception that you could beat the Islamic Republic out of Iran. Like you could just like, if you're mean enough, if you bomb them enough, if you drone strike them, if you sanction them and you cut them off from the rest of the world, eventually one day they're just going to like go back to the monarchy or become a democracy. And the reality is that's not really how it's going to work. Ideally, we would follow the same strategy that we used with Taiwan and South Korea, where we had we kind of infected the state with our culture. We had their elites travel to the West, which has happened in the past, right? A lot of Khamenei's kids, I believe, actually live in the West, and our culture basically infects the ruling class until they start saying, yeah, why don't we actually give more legitimacy to these elections? I mean, this is a little bit embarrassing that we're like a theocracy. That's kind of weird, right? And over time, as power becomes more diffuse, the incentive of elites is to play by the rules because nobody actually, like the risk of trying to violate the rules and overturn elections and be dictatorial increases, and the benefits of playing by the rules increases. And this is how pretty much the vast majority of countries that are like authoritarian have transitioned to democracies successfully, not by revolutions and certainly not by sanctions. We're sanctioning the hell out of Venezuela. They've not become a democracy because of that. If you want to look at the hardline approach to a country, look at Cuba. We have thrown everything at Cuba, and none of it has made them a democratic, liberal, capitalist country. But Vietnam, we've chilled out. We chilled out with Vietnam, and guess what? They're not completely authoritarian anymore. They're somewhat democratic, and they have by all accounts a capitalist economy. So I think
at the very least they're much more open. I think you compare Vietnam to North
kind
Korea.
of have an uninformed perception about how democratizing Iran would actually work in practice.
Yeah.
All right.
Sidetracked. It was a good little sidetrack. Some Iranian policy from our Iranian host, Micah Irfan. Well, all right. We're taking a positive spin this week with our final topic of the day. We often talk about how terrible America is in terms of its economic institutions. Somebody suggested, though, and we put it in our audience poll, and this is what the people of the Patreon
patreon.com/3wonks, voted for. Join to have a say in what we talk about on a week-to-week basis, $3 a month. They voted on what does the U.S. do right economically? What are the better things about U.S. economic organization? And I'll be honest, I struggled with this question, fellas. I'll go first. I have something written down here. I'll say this, and it's recent, but it is the thing that really popped out when I really tried to think about this. The IRA, legitimate banger. Okay, it is not perfect. It's not a perfect bill. Okay, there are things we could do to the IRA that would make the IRA even better.
Like
However,
multiply every number in it by 2.
exactly. Okay, that would be based. However, the IRA is actually a really, really good bill. Number one, negotiating on drug prices is a good policy. Like, that's a good thing that the U.S. does. You could also reference, like, our Medicare system seems to be really, really good. But I think that this is more like, what does the U.S. do uniquely that's good? At least that's how I kind of interpreted the question. There's a lot of socialized healthcare systems in the world, obviously, that are, more expansive than Medicare. But the IRA does seem to be relatively unique in some senses. The IRA is a significant domestic investment. It's huge investments, not only in industrial policy that we would think are positive, but they're significantly biased towards renewables and clean energy, which is not only an important technology for basically decarbonization, but it's also important that because these technologies are going to be so prominent, doing some industrial investment in those technologies and making the United States, maintain itself and continue to be a world leader on those technologies is really, really good. It was such a significant domestic investment that it caused many other countries to basically pass their own versions of the IRA to try and compete with the industrial policy of the United States with regards to the IRA subsidies. And if you ask me, if there is a race to the bottom that we can do, it's subsidizing renewable energy. And the IRA kicked that off to some degree internationally because of how expansive it was. And so I really do think the IRA is quite a good policy that the United States passed. And I think it's relative. It's not that the U.S. is the only country that's done renewables investment, but the IRA specifically seemed to inspire a lot of copycats. And I think that's probably a good thing that the U.S. has done. What do you guys think?
I mean, I totally agree. I did want to quibble that you called it the largest policy. And what I wondered is that the IRA is sort of like there was a blockage in climate policy for like a decade, and then we got this one big chunk. What I wondered is if other countries more gradually ramped up into green investments. And so like maybe it was the largest investment because it was sort of like the constipation of the US political system.
Yeah, I'm not sure, honestly. That could be it. I mean, I will say that the U.S. has a history of subsidizing solar and wind for like almost like wind for 30 years at the point of the IRA getting passed, and solar for a decade, to the point that solar has become the cheapest form of electricity. Same thing with electric vehicles. Like, a lot of what the IRA did is take the structure of our current subsidies and just double and triple down on them, right? And I think that that's what the IRA just, we're really good in that regard. The U.S. has been technically decarbonizing since I think about 2007. I want to say 2007 was peak emissions, and we've been going down and down and down.
I think
ever
per
since
capita,
then.
you might be right, but in absolute terms, I think it's more recent, like 2020 or something.
No, I think in nominal terms, our carbon emissions have been going down for actually quite a long time. I think in per capita terms, we've been going down since the 70s or something like that. It's actually been quite a long time. You think I'm wrong, STL? Google it. Bet money. Let's see. Let's look at STL look like a dum-dum right now on stream, live in front of the entire audience. Okay. U.S. per capita emissions over time. Let's see. Oh, well, would you look at that? Since we're going to go to the React screen. Since 1970, would you look at that? It's been falling. Exactly what Econoboy said. All right. And hold on. Let's look up really quick. Nominal U.S. total emissions over time. And let's see if we can find this quickly. U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. Here we go. And would you look at that? Since about 2007, we've been going down. I would like an apology, STL.
And also apologize. Your money. I will apologize, but I can't tell if that's
Yeah.
I'll get whatever buddy you want.
There
I'll
we
give it.
go. I've beaten SDL on this one. 1-0 Econoboy versus SDL on the fact checking battles. I'll take this victory. But no, actually, obviously I'm just joking. But the IRA significantly accelerates this decarbonization. I think it leads to about a 40. I want to say the math was like about a 40% reduction in emissions up to 2030. What were you going to say, SDL?
Okay, I know what it is. So there's a problem because of U.S. offshoring. So you have to look at consumption-based carbon emissions to get the full picture. And on that one, the turnaround was much later. I can link you the graph on that one. But you are correct on the domestic production side based carbon emissions.
Dab on them. All right. Well, what in terms of what the U.S. does right economically, I've mentioned the IRA. Mike and SDL, either one of you, what do you guys think the U.S. does right economically?
So the obvious example I have to point to is probably research spending. This is something that Mariana Mazzucato, a social democrat who's very in favor of industrial policy and research and development, noted that the U.S. has some of the most aggressive civilian research programs on Earth. Just in terms of R&D as a percent of GDP, this is both public and private. The U.S. is, I think, number 4 in the world. So not just in terms of absolute dollars, but in terms of how much of our economy we contribute towards researching the future, we're right up there. And all the other countries are tiny ones like Israel and Belgium and whatnot. So the US is the only major country to put this much money towards the future. I know that one thing that's sort of a remarkable achievement is the DOE's national laboratories. We have 19 host institutions around the country, and they sort of just let anyone come if they can pay for the cost of the experiment and do experiments with, like, hey, let's say you want to take a 3D X-ray scan of like a new material you're looking at. Well, pay us $40,000 and we'll just do it. And that's sort of that maybe seems a little commercialized, but it's actually remarkably accessible to pretty much everyone anywhere. Something like half of the users are from outside the United States, including places like the People's Republic of China. And so, like, I think that shit is actually extremely cool. It's like some of the most open science that you're going to get on the very cutting edge of mega laboratory required research. And just more broadly, we throw an immense amount of money at all of these problems. The US is one of the biggest funders of basic science in the world. So I think those things are worth being proud of. That, like, you know, I think we should do that even more because there's just enormous returns on investment. There's some estimates that these research provides something like a 5-to-1 dollars out versus dollars in. So let's do more. Like, let's really juice the shit out of this, which is a big part of Matsukuto's argument. And just to give you a little American pride, that a lot of European countries actually really fail on this. They have great social spending, but they have really shitty public research institutions, aside from like CERN, which is an international product, and a few other leading ones. And they have really shitty R&D spending as an overall profile. So that's one of our arguments.
My question for that is that's truly public investment. It's not like including private investment in R&D as well. It's just like our actual public investment is crazy.
That's both public and private. To be clear, on the like, I think it's like 4% of GDP or something goes to research and development. But that's both public and private. And actually, to be clear, something worth critical of is that public R&D has declined over the past half century. So I think we need to return to tradition and really fund public R&D. Get those numbers up to 5%, baby.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, R&D is pretty based, either full expensing for private R&D or just direct public investment, university system and military spending, DOE spending and whatnot. Micah, what does the U.S. do right economically, if you had to ask Micah Irfan?
So I actually have a lot of things listed here. First of all, disability access. The ADA is often considered world-class. And it is a really great reform. I think we can thank George Bush Sr. for that, back when Republicans heard about some folks that struggle. Our military has just tremendous capabilities, and I think that's something to be celebrated if it's used correctly. I think that we live in a period of time in which democracies are increasingly under attack by authoritarian countries. And so this kind of environment, our tremendous military abilities are something that can be very valuable for kind of a pro-freedom purpose. Our financial markets are very deep and very expansive. Now, how this relates to policy is, in many cases, the government can sabotage their own financial markets. We have not sabotaged our financial markets. Now, do we have the best approach ever to financial markets? No. But we haven't sabotaged, and plenty of countries have. Now, this is one that y'all are going to disagree with. We don't have price controls on drugs. Most of the world has
You got to
very
repeat that.
stringent.
You got to repeat that.
We do not have price controls on drugs. The majority of the world, the vast majority, almost every country has stringent price controls on drugs, which puts the price of drugs just above its marginal cost. So it's still profitable to sell the drug in those countries, but it's not profitable enough to justify the research and development necessary to create those drugs in the first place. And part of the reason why drug innovation occurs in this world is because we do not have those price controls. We basically subsidize the rest of the world's drug innovation, and they benefit from it. If we were to implement such price controls, you would see a huge reduction in the amount of research and development that is invested in terms of drugs, unless there was some sort of adjoining policy to subsidize research and development dramatically. But the reality is the vast majority of the world does not have that policy. They just have the price controls and they free ride. And that is a very bad policy. And the research is pretty uniform in respect to, there is a high degree of elasticity of drug research and development spending to prices. And so price controls genuinely would lead to a dramatic slowdown. And I invite anybody who's skeptical of that to look into the evidence. We also tend to allow a lot of immigrants. This has been one of our superpowers historically. We're all fans of expanding immigration, but we have a family blood-based immigration and a lot of work-based immigration. We also give out a lot of visas. That has been very beneficial to our country, and not all countries in the world, especially not all countries in the West, have such permissive policies. We have not destroyed our technology sector with regulations, although increasingly it seems like people are willing to do so. Europe has struggled with technological innovation because of their own willingness to self-sabotage. Our public sector workforce causes us less financial distress than other countries, such as France, which has a very huge public sector workforce with wages and contracts, which I think we broadly agree can be problematic for sustainability and productivity. And the last thing I'll say is labor market flexibility. Plenty of countries have sabotaged their own labor markets through imposing a wide array of measures, which make it harder for workers to move between businesses and harder for businesses to fire workers whenever they're not productively contributing, and hire workers whenever there's an opportunity. Now, we don't do enough to protect workers in our economy. We'd all like to see an economy where there's more active labor market policies to protect workers in times of transition. But we can at least give ourselves credit for not doing some of the plenty of bad ideas which are out there, which could really damage the efficiency of labor market allocation.
I think that one of the things that we haven't mentioned that I would probably want to throw in there with regards to what the U.S. does right economically, you could frame this as either a social or an economic policy, but it's kind of both. And this is kind of true for the entire Western Hemisphere. There's a lot of reasons, like socially, why that might be the case. It could be the history of the war on drugs or something, but the U.S. takes a relatively increasingly liberalization stance on drugs in general, right? Where the United States population has relatively open access to marijuana and things like that, either marijuana or Delta-8 variants, things like that, essentially in every single state. And that's a pretty good thing. It's actually kind of surprising how strictly illegal marijuana is in a lot of these Northern European countries, where like typically we would view Northern European countries as like substantially more progressive on essentially the entirety of the political spectrum. But when you look into their drug policies, it's kind of surprising that a lot of those countries' drug policies are still relatively strict, even on things like marijuana. And that's something that, like I said, the whole Western Hemisphere kind of gets credit for. I'm not really sure why. I'm sure that's a very complicated socio-political reason why countries in Asia and South Asia and the Pacific and places like that are just sort of stubbornly against legalization of even very minor drugs like alcohol. I mean, like recently, I think it was in 2021, New Zealand had a referenda to legalize marijuana, and they voted it down by a pretty substantial margin. It's like, man, the Kiwis are that against legalization of marijuana? Like, I guess so. That's kind of surprising. But SCL, what were we going to say?
I just we talked about this briefly last night, Akana Boy, and I want to highlight that there's no European country which has yet legalized marijuana. Germany voted to begin the process of legalizing marijuana, but that's it. It's the only one, aside from Malta, which I mean, it is a country, but it's also very tiny. So
Just a little baby country.
That's actually really surprising because I was in the Czech Republic one time and they were selling weed cookies.
So I think it's a lot of local. So I think Amsterdam. I don't know where you were in the Czech Republic, but my understanding is that there's a lot of localities where it's basically legal. But it's interesting at like a. So the reason I'm bringing this up is American states are roughly the same size as most European countries, and it's remarkable that something like maybe a half of U.S. states have fully legalized marijuana, but it is not a half of European states have fully legalized marijuana. That's maybe the contrast I was trying to draw.
One other really important one, which kind of hits on something we talked about earlier, is our central bank. People can hate the Fed all they want and say that sometimes they don't hit their mark correctly. They didn't get inflation high enough or inflation's too high. But it could be certainly much worse. Many countries don't have central bank independence at all, which leaves them in a pretty precarious position whenever recessions come around. Many countries have terrible central banks, which cause hyperinflation, or in the case of Europe, the European Central Bank, I think, is famously conservative. And so they've pursued a very controlled monetary policy, which is in part responsible for the growth slowdown of Europe. Now, of course, the growth slowdown of Europe seems to be over-exaggerated because you're measuring European output in terms of US dollars. And U.S. dollars have appreciated in relationship to the euro over time, so it makes their growth look absolutely awful. I think whenever you discount for that, still though, the Central Bank of Europe has been conservative. And we're fortunate to have a Federal Reserve, which has actually done most of the time a pretty good job. I mean, even regarding this recent inflation that we struggled with, they quickly brought it down and managed to do it without giving us a recession, which, mind you, most people thought was, very unlikely a year or a year and a half ago.
No, it is sort of funny that the U.S., despite being generally a much more economically conservative place, took generally a much more aggressive pro-stimulus approach in both 2008 and 2019. And so as a result, we've sort of reaped the rewards of that and have a much larger economy than most Europeans were projected to way back 20 years ago before these dual crises. So just I don't know exactly why that is. Like, what weird political calculus gives us no healthcare but great recession stimulus when it rolls around? But it is a positive. Here's hoping it keeps happening.
That's a good point, actually, because
it's just the product of our institutions.
I didn't really think about this, but that is correct though. That the whole of Europe essentially did austerity in response to 2008, and there wasn't much fiscal stimulus at all. It seems like it was quite the opposite. Whereas a lot of people critique the Obama stimulus for being too small, but we did stimulus. We didn't just cut all of our welfare spending, right?
I will say something that a lot of people forget is Obama wanted to do stimulus, but the Republicans wanted to do too much stimulus. Sorry, Obama wanted to do austerity, but the Republicans wanted to do too much austerity, and they couldn't come to an agreement on it. So in around 2013, 2014, that totally failed. We could have been like Europe, but because our conservatives are so goddamn conservative, we got austerity. So I'm just praying that every time we get into a recession, Democrats are in power. I think that so long as that happens, we're in a pretty good spot as a country.
Well, I mean, even Trump during COVID, Trump passed $3 trillion worth of stimulus as well. So I mean, there might have been the right wing populism maybe has some sort of a good effect in some sense, right? Where they're more likely to do stimulus during recessions.
I will just say on the drug policy, I do have to add the obvious caveat that the U.S. and one of our uniquely bad effects is that we have the largest prison population in the world. For an idea of a per capita rate on how high our prison rate is, people talk a lot about authoritarianism in the Soviet Union. Under Stalin, the imprisonment rate was about 4 times higher than it is in the United States, which sounds like a lot, but the U.S. imprisonment rate is 7 times higher than it is in Europe. So we are midway between Stalin's reign of terror and Europe.
Closer to Stalin.
And we are, in fact, closer to Stalin. And I bring it up because I think it's actually a deeply evil institution. And it's just worth bringing up because a lot of it emerged in the war on drugs. And we're still bearing the scars of it.
SDL, we're slipping into what the U.S. does wrong, okay?
Yeah,
we're
so
slipping
I know,
into
I'm pulling back.
We're supposed to be positive during this segment, all right?
One
But
thing that I've
yeah.
often been very in praise of is that the U.S. has such strong free speech laws that it's often hard. So there's upsides and downsides of it, right? That the free speech often means that a lot of lies get said, a lot of like bigoted speech gets said. But overall, the extremely strong free speech culture, I think, has been generally positive in the United States. That everything seems to be slightly more easily debated here. That people will try and do boycotts and cancellations, but they can't get the government on their side. You can't take someone to court over libel nearly as easily as you can in Britain, where all the time someone can just take you to court to force you to shut up. That doesn't seem to happen here. For better and worse, people can't be forced to shut up. So Americans are the yappers supreme of the world. I'm actually very pleased about that.
Yeah. Anything else, boys, about what the U.S. does right economically? We've been glazing, as we should have, given the topic, but I'm all out of ideas, to be frank.
I just want to note that, for at least for my list, so many of the things that we do better than other countries is just our failure to do anything bad on a subject. And I think it's just kind of, in large part, the product of our political institutions with tons of veto points. It's just really hard to do stuff, right? So if we mess up something, it's really hard to fix it. And it's also just harder to implement a bad policy in the first place. In other countries with a unicameral legislature or a political system which produces more consistent majorities and with less opportunities for blockage, it's a lot easier to get things right and a lot easier to get things wrong as well.
Yep, for sure. Yeah, your political, is an advantage and disadvantage into not being able to pass anything ever.
What does the U.S. do uniquely well? We haven't. We haven't enacted a theocracy. We haven't, like, glazing the U.S. just pointing to all the ways you could really fuck it up. I will say, actually, on that one, blasphemy laws are an interesting one where the U.S. just doesn't have them. And I want to be clear, that's partially a modern invention. The trend towards truly free of speech, it didn't exist in 1917. It didn't exist in 1967. They could arrest you for being a socialist. They could arrest you for being a communist. They could arrest you for burning the flag. But one of the upsides of having weirdly hyper-liberal, college-educated progressives on net in charge of the Supreme Court is this enormous drift towards like an absolute freedom of speech, which I really hope we can keep and maintain, that you could do pretty much whatever the fuck you want, and the state can't restrict your speech.
Yeah. All right. Well, all interesting stuff. The U.S. does some things right economically, and sometimes they fail to do the wrong thing, according to Micah, which is essentially the same thing. So those are some good things that the United States does, guys. We've glazed the United States, and now next episode, we're back to our regularly scheduled bitching about America. All right, never again are we going to do one of these positive. Notice that we only could spend 20 minutes talking about the good things that America does, but there's hours upon hours of content that we can produce talking about the bad things. There is a lot worth improving, but obviously there's a lot worth appreciating. We live in a wealthy country, so clearly done some things right over the years. And so that's it. That's what the U.S. does right economically for the most part. Well, there it is, guys. That's our show. We had a great time talking with everyone. Special shout out to our Patreons, Copy, Elias Jackson, Friedek, and William Fieni Theas. I am almost certainly not pronouncing that correctly, but thank you for being 10 Wonk members on the Patreon. Any final words for the people before we close out the show, gentlemen? Nothing at all. They remain
What
silent.
I will say is somebody called me out for being too bold in my claim about the EU's tech regulations. All I'm going to say is whatever they have done, whatever their policy arrangement is, it clearly has not been the most conducive to innovation, which explains their lower growth rates and why some of the most innovative companies in the world are located in this country and not their country and not Europe, just more broadly, despite the fact that they have what I think 100 million or so, over 150 million people on us or something like that. So just take the L, guys. I don't know what y'all are doing, but whatever you're doing, it's not working. I'm sorry.
The only things I wanted to add is the U.S. definitely has high levels of immigration, but I'm just saying, okay, there's a country right next to us which has even higher rates of immigration, and I'm just, there's something we can learn here from the little moose people.
Dude, every Canadian subreddit is like
filled with people that are just like, I hate immigrants. They're the worst. We need to
And
stop letting all these people
convinced that a lot of the anti-immigrant sentiment in Canada comes from the fact that they have just as shitty housing laws as the US does.
That's
on
not
the
true,
whole.
SDL. They have substantially worse housing laws than the US. Their housing
Well,
crisis is
because
unbelievable.
So I'm convinced that most people are totally fine with immigrants until their housing prices start changing and they can't find a place to live. And then suddenly it's a problem. There's too many people here. So if we could
Canada's
simply get the Canadian immigration policies and the Tokyo building policies, I think we could literally have
Yeah.
it's time
Canada's-
for 1 billion Americans, okay?
1 billion Canadians.
That's
No,
right.
Canada's housing policies are like if a whole country was San Francisco. It's like kind of unbelievable how, because if you look at their,
I did see there was an interesting graph on multi-story construction. So I know that housing laws are really bad in Canada, but apparently housing laws around multi-story like apartment building style construction are better enough to allow. I think Vancouver is building more than like the entire state of Texas, something along those lines. I can see if I can go find it, which I know sounds insane, but I know that this is a weird issue that I remember seeing a New York Times article on that elevators in the United States are really expensive. And so one of the unfortunate things is that even though YIMBY policies have seen some increase in housing construction, it's often a lot of housing construction in the like 4-story level zone. But if elevators were cheaper, as they are 4 times cheaper in highly unionized, unproductive Europe, apparently, then we could have a lot more high rises. I simply want everywhere to look like New York City. Is that too much to ask? Right? Is it too much to ask for 10-story buildings everywhere?
urban jungles abound, says SDL.
That's right.
But all right, guys. Well, hey, thanks for joining us this week. Thanks a ton for liking the stream. We'll be back in a couple weeks where we will do our policy draft and we will talk about various topics. Be sure to join the Patreon to participate in the policy draft and also to let us know what we should talk about in the next episode. Thanks again for tuning in to another show, guys.